to Story Rhyme with Brendan, where I read a story or a poem for you. This time I'll read Part 4 of The Adventures of Ralph Rashleigh by James Tucker. This story is about a convict to Australia. In Part 3, Ralph was paying his dues and then some as a convict, both in government holdings and to a settler, even helping out with King's Plays. We had left him last when he had fled to the constables due to settler mistreatment. Well, let's continue. Chapter 13. The only light in the lock-up came through the chinks in the wall from the adjoining room, and when his eyes had accustomed themselves to the gloom, Rashleigh made out the form of a tall, powerfully built man lying in an opossum rug on the floor. The prisoner made no reply to his salutations, and resisted all his efforts to draw him into talk, until Rashleigh lighted a pipe. Then the man sat up and asked for a fill of tobacco. As he, being handcuffed, was unable to get at his smoking equipment himself. When his pipe was well alight, the stranger abandoned his very reserved manner, smiling grimly as he nodded towards the wall, behind which his captors were making merry on the spirits which they had brought for the celebration of their capture. "Aye, booze away, my boys," he said sardonically. "You think you've done a mighty clever thing, but my turn is coming again. A damn sight sooner than you guess." It was already obvious to Rashleigh, from what he had overheard, that this was no ordinary prisoner, but the answers to the questions which he put to the man were met evasively, and finding that the fellow's taciturnity had returned as a result of these inquiries, he made himself as comfortable as he could and went to sleep, congratulating himself on being even for a few days free from the horrors of the Arlott homestead. He seemed to have been asleep for some hours, when he was awakened by a rough shaking and someone saying, "Get up and come along." Still dazed with sleep, the only thing he noticed at first was that the door of the lock-up was open, and that the tall figure of his fellow prisoner was walking towards it. He sprang up and began to dress himself, but before he had finished, the man reappeared. "Why in the hell don't you make haste? Come on, quick!" There was a threat in the voice that made Rashleigh pick up his jacket and hurry into the adjoining room, where he found half a dozen roughly dressed men, fully armed, and 2 constables fast in a drunken slumber, their heads lying on their arms on the table. "Now," said one of the men in a voice which Rashleigh recognised as that of his companion, "get some fire sticks. We'll set fire to the hut and burn it, and these blasted dogs together." The newcomers, with cries of assent, set about obeying their leader's order, while Rashleigh looked on in horror. "For God's sake," he interposed, "don't be such fools as to burn them. You can make a safe getaway without murder. They won't wake to give the alarm for hours." "Hold your damn tongue," rasped the leader, swinging round on him threateningly, "or we'll handcuff you and throw you neck and crop into the fire and roast you like a snake in a log." Rashleigh's reply was cut short by the man clapping a hand over his mouth and running him easily out of the hut with the other. He was trundled along for a short distance, and then the two of them turned to watch the flames rapidly blaze round the lock-up. All his hard experiences had not calloused Rashleigh's heart, and he turned sick as his imagination pictured the 2 constables waking to find themselves trapped in a roaring furnace. He could only hope that a door or a window shutter had been left unfastened, but the same thought also occurred to his captor. "Has anyone fastened the jigger and jumps?" Door and windows. He called to the men near the blazing pile. "Yes, I did," answered one of them. "I took care to see that there wasn't a single hole for the swine to crawl through." Rashleigh began to plead and protest, but was cut short by maledictions. "At least," he pestered, "save the woman and children. The constable's wife and children are upstairs." "Now by the hell and the devil," roared the leader, pressing a cocked pistol against Rashleigh's ear, "if you so much as whisper again, I'll blow out your blasted brains." There was a determination on the ruffian's ferocious face, clearly outlined in the light of the fire, that persuaded Rashleigh that it was no empty threat, and he could only stand by, wringing his hands in agony. The thatch of the roof was already burned clean out, and the roof tree timbers were a pattern of licking flames, but still there was no sign of the slumbering inmates. Perhaps the constables, deep in intoxicated sleep, had been suffocated in their sleep without regaining consciousness. But what of the mother and her children? He prayed fiercely that the same easier death might have overcome them, when suddenly the blazing roof collapsed, falling into the room in which they were sleeping, sending a fountain of sparks and small embers soaring skywards. The woman's scream, high-pitched and terrified, ripped through the quiet of the night, followed immediately by the wailing shrieks of little children, and the yells of the trapped men. Rashleigh saw the forms of both men outlined against the flames, as they struggled to break out, and, careless now of threats and personal safety, he rushed forward to their help. As he ran, a window shutter was burst open, and one of the constables jumped through, and as he touched ground, 5 guns were discharged, and just before he fell unconscious from a thudding blow on the back of his head, Rashleigh saw the figure leap convulsively and fall back dead. He came to his senses with a consciousness of a throbbing head and a body aching in every bone, but when he tried to rise, he found that he was securely tied down to the ground. His struggles attracted the attention of a guard. "Lie still and be damned to you," said a menacing voice, "or you'll get another sock over the head that'll stop you waking forever." It was futile to struggle in any case, so he lay still until dawn, when he saw the desperadoes of the night sprawled around him on the ground under an overhanging rock. They slept late into the morning, when some of the men rose and prepared a breakfast of tea, broiled meat and dough cakes, which they cooked on the spot. When the meal was ready, the whole gang of 7 gathered round the fire, and for the first time since they had so terribly intruded into his life, Rashleigh had an opportunity of observing them. They looked as tough a gang of blackguards as could be found even in a country largely populated by bound and free criminals. Some of them still wore their tattered convict dress, and the others wore an assortment of clothing which could only have been stolen piecemeal. Their method of living thus in the bush, the foul crime of last night, and their fully armed state left no doubt in Rashleigh's mind but that he had fallen in with one of those bands of bushrangers which for so long were the terror of decent folk throughout New South Wales. Why, he wondered, had they troubled to bring him away with them? Why had not they killed him out of hand, and thus prevented him forever from playing the informer, which was obviously their only danger from him? No one spoke to him, and he dared not address them, since he had learnt during that night of tragic phantasmagoria that unasked speech was indiscreet. Once they had finished breakfast, he was not left longer in doubts as to their intentions. A bushranger came over and freed him from his tight bonds, and led him over to the leader, who was seated on a mound at the entrance of the cavern which was hollowed under the great rock. Rashleigh looked the man over, and understood why he of them all was the leader. Physically, he towered above his companions, and there was that about him which told unmistakably of grim strength of purpose matching the physical power of his great frame. He carried 2 large pistols in his belt, which he fingered as his captive approached. "Stand off, and don't come any closer," he said, with a rasp in his tone. "What were you in the lock-up for?" "I gave myself up to complain of my master." "Oh, you're the complaining sort, are you?" sneered the other. "He was your master." "One Bob Arluck of Aird's," answered Rashleigh. "Well, and what did he do to you?" "He wanted to starve me to death, and work the flesh off my bones." The bushranger looked him over contemptuously. "Then why the devil didn't you knock his brains in, and take to the bush?" he demanded. "Wouldn't you like to be revenged on him?" "Why, yes, I would," answered Rashleigh, "if it could be done without murdering him and his family." "Murder be blowed," retorted the other. "If it was me, I'd set fire to the old brute's place, and burn him and his easy as kiss my hand. What's the good of driven devils like us being soft? Murder? Why, it's nothing but simple justice." The bitterness that lay behind his words was terrible, and Rashleigh, remembering last night's horror, was glad that he was not marked down for this brute's revenge. The recollection of the night was so vivid that he seemed again to hear the piercing shrieks of the mother and children, and see the shuddering convulsions of the shot constable as he fell in flames. and a violent fit of trembling overcame him, so that he literally shook before the bushranger. "You chicken-hearted, crawling fool," he said sneeringly. "I can see that you're the sort that would stand for anything and be anybody's footmat, rather than stand up for your rights like a real man. Pah! You weren't worth saving. I wish I'd left you in the lock-up to burn. Supposing we were taken, you're just the sort to get us all hung." "Ain't that what I said?" interposed one of the gang, named O'Leary. "I say he's too much of a cur to be safe for us alive." "Let's knock him over the head and be done with him," said another, and it was clear from the threatening expressions of the rest of the gang and the way they handled their weapons that the majority favoured the sentiment of the last speaker. "Silence," roared the leader commandingly. "I've not have him hurt, that's flat. We want someone to carry our swag and cook our grub, for you all grumble like hell at having to take your turns. That's what he shall do, and it will be strange if 7 men can't manage to watch one." And, he added, with a meaning look at his prisoner, "at the first sign of anything like treachery, he shall die like a dog, if he were 20 times my own father. That's our way with traitors in this gang, and don't forget it." Rashleigh was then allowed to get a bite of breakfast, and in a very short time the bushrangers, with the prisoner carrying the heaviest load, broke camp and set off. Before departing, Foxley, the leader, set a man to guard him, and appointed another to watch him at night, explaining that the guards would be changed, so that all the 6 men should have him in charge in turn. The gang travelled in a disorderly group, making no pretence of going silently, as if they had no fear of being interfered with in this rough country, over broken ranges through which they tramped until nightfall, when they made a fire beside a running creek. Ralph at once set about preparing a meal, and while they were eating, the talk turned upon their recent crimes. It was clear from the snatches of conversation which Rashleigh was able to overhear that all the occupants of the district constable's hut had been done to death, the second man having also jumped from the window, only to meet his death from a volley, as had his comrade. Both bodies had apparently been flung back into the fire. The woman and children had been unable to get out of the flaming trap, and it was callously surmised that they had all been burnt to death, as 2 of the gang had stood by until the place was a heap of smoking ruins. While ruminating on the incredible depths of cruelty to which men could sink, Rashleigh was sharply ordered to prepare some dough and bake it in the ashes of the fire. As he opened the flour bag, Foxley remarked that the supply was getting low, but that it was not important, as they would very soon replenish it. From this and other remarks, he gathered that some new depredation was imminent. The bread being baked, the whole party lay down for the night. Rashleigh handcuffed to his night guard. The night passed without incident, and after a hurried meal next morning, they set out again without pausing until midday, when one of the men said that he knew from the lie of the land that they were now not far from Campbelltown. Rashleigh thought that the man must be mistaken, as judging by the distance they walked, he imagined that they must be nearer to Liverpool or Sydney. But he soon learnt that bushrangers took circuitous routes through wild country as a matter of course, often travelling great distances to reach a destination only a few miles away by crow flight. The party penetrated a dense scrub so closely grown that they could not be seen at a distance of 3 yards, and began to clean and prepare their arms and make face masks. This done, they lay quiet until dusk. Nightfall saw them in motion again. They went steadily for 4 miles through open forest land, and then halted, while 2 of their number were sent forward as scouts to observe what was happening at the house they intended to attack. As soon as they had returned and reported to Foxley, the whole gang moved stealthily forward, guided by the spies. The single bark of a dog was the only interruption when they came to a narrow lane, where, after a consultation, the party divided itself into 2 groups of 4, one climbing the fence on the right of the lane, and the other continuing along it in careful silence. Rashleigh was with the latter quartet, and after proceeding a few rods, was deeply concerned to find that the cottage at which the bushrangers paused was none other than that in which he had been so hospitably entertained by the marshals. His fears for his friends increased when he gathered from the threatening talk of Foxley that Bob Marshall had at one time been Foxley's overseer and had had him flogged, and that the bushranger had now come to take his revenge. Silence and darkness seemed to fill the doomed house, and what particularly surprised Rashleigh was that there was no sign of the 6 ferocious dogs which he knew Marshall had about the place as a protection against just such an event as this. 2 of them in particular had been trained to pull down and kill anyone hanging about after dark, and yet not so much as a bark occurred. As a fact, the animals had been shut up in a shed for the night in order to prevent an accidental attack upon any of the guests who had been invited to the christening party in honour of the marshal's youngest child, which was going on when the marauders arrived. The gang knew nothing of this until, while anxiously awaiting a signal from the Confederates, a peal of merriment rang out from a building at the rear of the cottage, together with the music of fiddle and tambourine, the common instruments at a colonial chivo of merrymaking. On hearing this, the bushrangers passed along the side of the house into the stockyard, and came to a large barn, through the chinks of which light was streaming. A dance was evidently in progress, and the 4 men waited outside until joined by the other 4. When they had come up, Foxley ordered a search of the other barns and outhouses, and no one being found in them, he went to the barn door and knocked loudly. After a short pause, the door was thrown open, and the merry gathering saw, instead of a late guest, a grim array of armed and masked figures massed in the doorway. Screaming children clutched at the skirts of pale and terrified women, and the men huddled together, unarmed and helpless. Foxley, with a coarse laugh, advanced into the centre of the floor, glaring fearfully at the assembled through the slits of his mask. "What," he roared, "are you all scared of a few young fellows coming to your spree uninvited? Won't anyone welcome us? Where's our host? Ah, there you are, Mr. Bob Marshall. Come out here." Foxley's pistol was cocked and pointed at Marshall's head, and the settler had no alternative but reluctantly to obey the summons. "You're not going to shoot an unarmed man, are you?" he said in an anxious voice, looking round to where his wife was standing, surrounded by the terrified children. Foxley made no reply, but signed to O'Leary, who came forward with a pair of handcuffs, which he fastened to Marshall's wrists, and then led him out of the barn. The leader then proceeded with the secondary business of his raid, ordering all the inmates of the place to group themselves on one side of the door, while 2 of the bushrangers proceeded to pick the pockets of every one of both sexes, and to rob the women of their jewellery. One young woman went into a violent fit of hysterics, causing a great deal of confusion by her struggles and cries, and one young couple, taking advantage of this, slipped silently through the doorway. Rashleigh saw them go, and confronted them as they were about to climb a fence. His masked face caused the girl to shriek, but her companion turned boldly on the intruder. "I dare say you are armed," he said, ignoring or misinterpreting Rashleigh's deprecatory gesture, "but you had better stand back, for by heaven, you shan't lay a finger on that girl except across my dead body." "Be quiet, for God's sake," said Rashleigh. "Luckily your friend's scream was drowned by the row going on in there, or you would have been nabbed by now." "Look here, man," interpreted the other. "Here's all the money I have, and my watch. Take that and let her go. I don't give a damn about myself." "No," answered Rashleigh, "I don't want your money. Run like the devil to Campbelltown, and tell the chief constable that Foxley, the murderer, and his gang are here, and tell him to hurry with help, or he will be too late to save Marshall and his family from being slaughtered. Go quickly." While the 2 made off swiftly into the night, Rashleigh cautiously returned to the place that had been assigned to him in the shadow of the barn. Foxley was still standing in the doorway, supervising the pillage of Marshall's guests, searching every individual thoroughly, without any regard to modesty or decency, until he had before him a great pile of mixed booty, money, jewels, watches, trinkets, silk handkerchiefs, coats and waistcoats. Everything that could be of the slightest value to the bushrangers had been taken to swell the pile. He was inexorable, no sentimental appeals for the most valueless trinket having the least effect upon his iron heart. Tears, lamentations, and entreaties leaving him unmoved. The most valuable of the smaller articles of plunder he crammed into his pockets and into his hat, ordering the rest of the loot to be packed into sacks. The sacks he put outside the door and, leaving 2 of the gang to guard the prisoners in the barn, went across the stockyard to where O'Leary was standing guard over Bob Marshall. He ordered the pair to follow him and called to Rashleigh to follow them with the provision bags. Coming to the back door of the cottage and finding it locked, Foxley burst it open and the 3 men with the prisoner walked in. The house being in darkness, O'Leary was sent for a light, and on returning with it, the table was found to be loaded with lashings of food and drink, ready for the feast. "What money have you got in the house?" demanded Foxley of Marshall. "Only about £4, replied Marshall. Foxley then drove the unfortunate settler before him to show him where the cash was, and in a few moments Rashleigh heard the noise of furniture being smashed, and the loud curses of Foxley at the meagreness of the plunder. They came back to the room, leaving the bedroom door open, revealing the disorder of the results of the man's anger in strewn clothes, broken drawers, and overturned chairs. Marshall was next forced to disclose his stock of tea and sugar, which Rashleigh transferred into his provender bags under O'Leary's direction. "What's happened to the money you got from the sale of your wheat?" he heard Foxley ask the settler, who answered that it had all been paid away, with the exception of the amount of which the bushranger had possessed himself. "I know that's a damned lie," shouted the ruffian, "but it don't matter. If I can't get it, I'll take damn good care that you don't live to enjoy it." His meaning was so clear that Marshall showed signs of fear, and turning to the implacable bushranger, he began again to plead. "Surely you wouldn't murder a defenceless man. He never did you any harm," he began, but Foxley silenced him with an oath. "Think of my poor wife and children," Marshall continued. "Think of your damned tyranny," snarled Foxley, suddenly snatching off his mask. "Look at my face, and see if you recognise Philip Foxley, whom you got flogged for neglect of work." He paused to enjoy the effect of his revelation, and then went on in a voice terrible with malignancy. "If you had as many lives as I got lashes through you, 10 times more, I'd take every one of them tonight. So make up your mind to die. I've already slaughtered 11 of my old masters and overseers, and you'll do nicely to round off the dozen. There's some debts that I never forget to repay." Rashleigh saw his friend's frame tremble with terror at the fate with which Foxley threatened him, for the bushranger was notorious as one of the most bloodthirsty devils living without the law, and his mere identity had shaken Marshall's nerve. With an effort, the settler calmed himself and, unresisting, allowed Foxy to drive him out into the stockyard. No sooner was he out in the open than his wife and her sister sprang forward and caught him in their arms, demanding to know what they were doing with him. Somehow they had run the gauntlet of the guard of the barn, who were not so far degraded as to fire easily upon women. "Drag those women away," shouted Foxley, enraged at this interruption in his plan of vengeance, for the execution of which he was now impatient. Mrs. Marshall and Jane struggled heroically to retain their hold on their doomed relative, but their strength was no match for that of the ruffians, and in a few moments they were being dragged back to the barn. "McCoy, you take him over there," commanded Foxley, indicated Rashleigh. "And you, O'Leary, is your piece loaded with ball?" "It is," was the viciously laconic reply. Then Marshall kneeled down and prayed for the last time. He said in a cold tone, "I'll give you 10 minutes." Still as a rock, Foxley took out his watch and stood watching the dial by the light held by one of the bushrangers, and as Rashleigh moved away with McCoy, he could hear the frenzied voice of the settler, not praying to God, but begging the bushranger for mercy. Turning to look back, he saw that Foxley did not so much as raise his eyes from the watch face to look at the man he was about to murder. Sick at heart at his own impotence to help his friend, he reached the fence to which he had been ordered with his guard, and was about to climb over it when a yell from Foxley startled him. "Down! Down on your knees, you scum!" he heard him shout in a frenzied tone. "Here, O'Leary, he won't pray, so be ready when I give the word, and aim right between the eyes." Marshall's answering wild supplications for mercy were suddenly drowned by the reports of about a dozen muskets. Rashleigh looked around in alarm and saw the bushranger, who was holding the light for Foxley, fall to the ground with a piercing yell of pain. "Surrender in the King's name," vociferated several voices at once. "Fire at the swine and keep close together," came the answering shout from Foxley. The darkness was spangled with bright flashes of the guns, followed by a pandemonium of shouts, during which the bushrangers, forming round their leader, made their way to the fence where McCoy and Rashleigh had remained. Paralysed by the suddenness of the attack, they scaled the fence in a body and raced across the martial clearing and reached the cover of the standing timber. "Have you got the slavey safe?" demanded Foxley, as they paused for breath. "I have," came the answer out of the darkness. "That's lucky for you," retorted Foxley, "for if he had escaped, I'd have finished you where you stand." The gang found themselves reduced in number to 5, 3 of them having fallen at the opening of the attack, but whether they were dead or only wounded, no one had had time to discover. They travelled hard in an easterly direction all night, and when daylight came, went into hiding in a deep and rugged gully. They were in a bad humour, for the food had all been left behind in the hurry to escape, and all the plunder lost except for small articles which Foxley and McCoy had concealed about their persons. Rashleigh himself was in a bitter mood. He had thrown away the chance to escape with the young couple whom he had helped in the hope that he might be able to do something to save Marshall and help the police in the capturing of the gang. The close guard of McCoy had prevented him doing anything but look on, however, and his only satisfaction was that he had at least been instrumental in saving the settler's life. Handcuffed to McCoy, he lay watching the ease with which his companion slept after doings which kept him awake with horror, and wondering how long it would be before he managed to escape from their foul company. When the bushrangers awakened, all hungry, they turned fiercely upon their compulsory cook and carrier. Cursing him for having been such a fool as to leave the provisions behind, O'Leary added a sound blow over the head to his complaint, and was about to repeat the dose when Foxley intervened. The man turned on his leader with imprecations and threats, and the fight between them was only prevented by the intervention of the other members of the gang. Peace of a kind was patched up, though O'Leary showed by his malignant glances at both Rashleigh and his leader that he was only biding his time. Towards evening, Foxley and McCoy assembled all the spoil which they had brought away, and the leader divvied it up into 4 approximately even parts, and the men cast lots as to who should have which share. Rashleigh was, of course, not a party to this dividing of the spoils. Next it was decided by lot who should go into Campbelltown or Liverpool to purchase a supply of food, and the task of falling to O'Leary, each of the bushrangers gave him a sum of money. He then disarmed himself and set off. After he had gone, the other 3 men held a conference, and from the odd sentences which Rashleigh overheard, he concluded that they doubted O'Leary's loyalty to the gang generally, and that Foxley feared immediate treachery from him. He suggested that they should move to cover in a more secluded spot until O'Leary came back, so that, should he bring anyone with him, they would have a chance to fly. They therefore went about half a mile distant from the camp into the bed of a narrow valley overhung with trees. Foxley went back and lay in hiding near the camping ground to be ready to guide O'Leary to the new hiding place, should his fears prove mistaken, leaving Rashleigh, McCoy and Smith dozing by the fire. Late in the evening they were aroused by the return of O'Leary, accompanied by Foxley, bringing with him a good supply of tea, sugar, bread and salt pork, and 4 bottles of rum. Rashleigh hastily cooked some of the meat in a calabash and brewed some tea, and was about to share the meal with the gang. When they had finished eating, O'Leary proposed that they should all have some grog, and produced a bullock's horn tip as a drinking cup. His manner struck the others as suspiciously friendly all of a sudden, and it was noticed that while he pressed the others to copious draughts of rum. He himself drank scarcely any. He explained that he had drunk all he could carry at Campbelltown. His good humour increased until he was almost gay, while Foxley grew more and more gloomy and taciturn, and at last he wrapped himself in his skin cloak and lay down to sleep. Rashleigh, whom they omitted to handcuff, followed his example, and the effects of the rum made him fall quickly asleep. He awakened suddenly, aroused by the roar of fire in a sudden squall of wind. He got up and took a place farther from the fire, and as he lay down again, he noticed that the other two bushrangers were snoring in the deep sleep of intoxication. O'Leary lay at a little distance, as if asleep, but the watcher caught a gleam in one of his eyes as the flame flickered, lighting up his face. Rashleigh was already half asleep when he noticed O'Leary turn his head and look furtively towards himself and Foxley, who was as deep in sleep as the others. The suspicions which he had heard mentioned by the others, and the queer behaviour of the man after supper, made Rashleigh keep watch on him while feigning sleep. He saw O'Leary rise cautiously, take the calabash in which the pork had been boiled, and creep towards where McCoy and Smith lay with their guns beside them. He dropped some of the liquid over the locks of the guns, and split some also over the pistols in their belts. He now cautiously approached his leader, placing an open knife between his teeth. His dread of Foxley was clear from the scared look on his face as he peered into his sleeping face. Foxley's gun lay between his knees, so that it could not be moved without waking him, so O'Leary gently unscrewed the bolt which secured the flint, which he could get at without disturbing the sleeper. He then opened the pans of both pistols, so that the primer fell out, and treated the locks with liquid from the calabash. Paying no attention to the unarmed cook, O'Leary rose to his feet, picked up his own musket, and stealthily disappeared in the direction of Campbelltown. It was clear to Rashleigh that the man intended to play the traitor to his gang, his confederates' arms having been made useless. He had evidently gone to guide the police to them. His first notion was to make good his escape while his captors slept, and leave them to the fate they so richly deserved, and give himself up to the police. But he reflected that, if O'Leary's plan were successful, as seemed certain unless he warned the others, he would undoubtedly be convicted. O'Leary's word would certainly be accepted, and his unveiled dislike of Rashleigh promised that he would make the case against him even blacker than against the others, as being actively concerned in the robbery and attempted murder of Bob Marshall. The idea of being tried for complacency in this crime was especially repugnant to him, as he could not endure the thought that Mrs. Marshall and her sister, who had treated him so companionably, should have even false cause to suspect him of being base ingratitude as to have joined, freely or by compulsion of circumstances, in the attempt which had been made upon them. He decided to awaken Foxley and denounce O'Leary to him. He went cautiously over to where the leader lay, and aroused him with a touch of his foot, causing Foxley to leap to his feet and simultaneously level his weapon at Rashleigh's head. "Stand off, or I'll fire," he cried. "I'll never be taken alive." Then, seeing who it was confronting him, he listened while Rashleigh acquainted him with O'Leary's actions and his suspicions of what they portended. Foxley, having confirmed these statements by examining his weapons, awakened McCoy and Smith, and warned them of the danger that threatened them. The bushrangers hurriedly cleaned, loaded, and primed their firearms, and, after a short discussion, decided to withdraw to the thickest of the neighbouring scrubs, and there await events. Having disposed Foxley's opossum skin rug and part of the clothing of the other men, to give the semblance of sleeping men in the places where they had previously lain, they retired to their watching places. The time of waiting in the intense cold seemed interminable, but at last their strained hearing detected the noise of crackling twigs and the rustling in the brushwood. Rashleigh, standing next to Foxley, was appalled at the savage expression which made his face diabolical as he watched to see what these sounds portended. His eyes were glaring with cunning and bloodthirstiness, and his tongue wet his lips as he saw O'Leary approach the abandoned bivouac with cat-like stealth. O'Leary carried a gun and was followed by 4 well-armed men into the open space. After a whispered consultation, they separated and approached the heaps of clothing, which they took to be their victims. At a sign from Foxley, he and his confederates fired at the constables, 2 of whom fell immediately, before O'Leary had recovered sufficiently from his surprise to be able to present his piece. Foxley clubbed his gun and, rushing upon the traitor, dealt him a blow which broke the stock of the musket and dropped him without even a groan. The unwounded constables fired their pieces at random and then made off. The 3 bushrangers surrounded the fallen traitor. "He ain't dead," said Smith in a venomous tone. "Stand aside while I blow his brains out." "Hold!" shouted Foxley, knocking up the other's gun as he was about to fire. "Don't hurt him for your life. I wouldn't let him die so easy a death for £1,000. He fetched water and bathed O'Leary's face until he recovered consciousness. The bushrangers then proceeded to examine the fallen man. The first was stone dead, and while they were stripping the body naked, Rashleigh saw the other, whose thigh was broken, raise himself and, deliberately resting his barrel on a log, take careful aim at McCoy, who, unaware of his danger, was standing guard over O'Leary. The bullet just missed the bushranger, burying itself into the trunk of the tree against which he leaned. Foxley, with a bestial roar, sprang upon the wounded constable with his knife, stabbing him with abandoned savagery until his yells weakened into muffled sobs. As the ringleader raised himself, McCoy sprang in to finish the job, battering in the skull until the brains were pulped. They then completed the gruesome task of stripping the 2 corpses, which they flung into a waterhole. Rashleigh almost pitied O'Leary as his intended victims turned their attention to him. They tied him safely against any attempt to escape and drove him forward with blows and exhortations, whilst Rashleigh went on in front of the queer procession, loaded with the provisions. Shortly after daylight, they crossed the Great South Road, one of the bushrangers scouting ahead to ensure their way being clear, until they entered a track of gloomy and sterile country, which sloped downwards unbroken by any timber except the miscalled forest oak, a tree which seemed to Rashleigh to have been so named by a cynic because of its utter dissimilarity to the oak of England. The spot at which the party finally halted in the afternoon seemed to Rashleigh portentous of the crime which he was sure was about to be committed. It was a great vault-like glade, formed of gloomy trees, which grew out of grassless gravel soil, shutting out the sun. The silence which brooded there seemed treacherous and unclean, as if nature was malignantly still in anticipation of the foul crime which was toward. He was ordered to make a fire and prepare some food, while O'Leary was partially unbound. Foxley eyed the traitor with stern hate for some minutes. "Well," he said at last, "have you got anything to say for yourself, you blasted wretch?" "No, I'm only sorry you weren't all grabbed," retorted O'Leary, in a tone of concentrated hatred. "There's nothing on earth I'd rather see than all 3 of you bloody cowardly murdering dogs hanging in a row." McCoy, standing there, raised his musket and struck the traitor full in the mouth, driving in his front teeth. O'Leary fell unconscious, but Foxley was remorseless. "Get some water and bring him to his senses," he ordered. "Then we'll make him fast to a tree and flog him for as long as we can stand over him. After that, we'll hang him up to feed the crows." O'Leary recovered consciousness and was duly bound to a tree. Foxley, the corners of his mouth drooping with barbarity, took off his broad leathern belt and began to flog him with a buckle end. Rashleigh's stomach turned at the sight of the bloody back, the flesh of which was rawed to the bone before Foxley's arm tied, and he handed the belt to Smith. He had seen many vicious floggings, but they were as nothing to this, which Smith continued until O'Leary's shrieks and bitter oaths gradually ceased and his head fell on one side, his frame drooping in its bonds. "So you're fainting, are you?" exclaimed McCoy, taking the belt from Smith. "I'll bring you to again." The sagging body was once more bellowboard with the ruddy buckle end, until it seemed to Rashleigh that the traitor must be dead. "Hold your hand, McCoy," said Foxley, "or he'll not have enough life left in him to make him worth hanging." All ordinary methods of resuscitation failed to bring the suffering ruffian back to consciousness. When Smith sliced a piece of salt pork into the water in which Rashleigh had washed other slices and poured the briny liquid into the lacerations of their victim's back, this treatment reminded Rashleigh of the curative treatment on the hulk at Portsmouth, was instantly efficacious. O'Leary screamed and howled in torment, punctuating his cries with such bitter reproaches that Foxley ordered him to be gagged. It was clear to Rashleigh that torture had numbed the fellow's senses, for he was watching with dull eyes the other bushrangers plaiting a cord of stout vines, saw one of them climb a selected tree and fasten one end of the rope round a limb 12 feet from the ground. Without seeming to comprehend that these activities had any connection with his doom, it was not until the running noose was made and a pile of logs set up immediately underneath that his dulled wits functioned. He suddenly began to struggle with his bonds, and gnashed his teeth upon the securely tied gag stick, muttering incoherently, his eyes rolling and glaring with rage. The bonds held, and the gag would not be bitten through. Foxley, having assured himself that everything was in readiness for the final act of his play of ruthless vengeance, caught at O'Leary and began to drag him towards the improvised gallows. But the prisoner flung himself to the ground and struggled so formidably, despite his bonds, that it was all that Foxley and Smith between them could do to lift him to the pile of logs which were to be his last stance on earth. His struggles resulted in the pile of logs collapsing, but there was little strength left in the frenzied man's frame. The noose was fastened around his neck, and Foxley, taking him bodily in his arms, lifted him onto the falling logs, ordered his confederates to tauten the rope, and then flung the traitor's body from him with a savage gesture. O'Leary swung to and fro, his limbs twitching and jerking in a fashion which turned Rashleigh sick. He had forgotten the attempted treachery which had caused the scene. He saw only a fellow man suffering eternities of unnecessary, diabolical agony. Somehow he could not tear his gaze away from that twitching, convulsed, grotesque body and the staring, glazing eyes in a face turning slowly from blue to black. It was an offence against humanity. "Oh, blow the poor devil's brains out," he cried, in an agony of pity. "Blow nothing," retorted the leader. "I wouldn't shorten his jig by a single second. Not for £1,000,000. He did worse than a dog's deed of dirt. Now let him die worse than a dog's death." Foxley watched with an expression of malignant satisfaction as the death rattle came at last, accompanied by a frame-shaking convulsion of the limbs, and O'Leary was an unsightly corpse turning slowly at the end of a stretched rope. Rashleigh was at once ordered to prepare food, which the 3 bushrangers ate hungrily, seasoning the meal with coarse jests about the appearance of their dead comrade in his death pangs. With the consciousness of the corpse swinging so near at hand, the cook had no stomach or appetite for food. He gathered up the fragments of the meal and the few utensils, and longed to hear the order to proceed on their way and put as great a distance as possible between him and the slowly twirling hanged man. "Hi, you! Gather up some fuel and stick it under that," Foxley ordered him, jerking his head towards O'Leary's corpse. There was no use in protesting or refusing, and Rashleigh, his heart heavy with sickness, did as he was bidden. Foxley set fire to the pile and cut the rope as soon as the blaze was leaping. "The crawling scoundrel's got a warmer bed now he's dead than ever he had in life," remarked Foxley with a harsh laugh. "Come, boys, stoke up." While Rashleigh stood by, sickened by the ghastliness of the scene and the foul stench of burning flesh, the bushrangers joked and gibed as they fed the pyre until the gruesome cremation was completed. The party then proceeded on their way to their next infamy, making not even a pretence at burying O'Leary's remains. Chapter 14. About noontide of the following day, they reached the Cowpasture River, which they crossed on a catamaran improvised from apple-tree boughs bound together with vines. and gained the rough, broken country lying at the foot of the mountain range which traverses the middle of New Holland. Never had Rashleigh been in a more solitary and forbidding place, and so poor was the soil that even the native grasses grew so scantily that there was not pasturage even for the hardy indigenous animals of Australia. They travelled for 3 days through this sterile country without coming upon a house or a single human being. To add to the prevailing depression, the provisions began to run short, but towards noon on the 4th day they came to the summit of a lofty range, from which could be seen a prospect of such beauty and majesty that Rashleigh forgot for a few minutes all the torments and fears that had companioned him, whilst he revelled in the glory of the panorama below and before them. The steep precipice fell for some hundreds of feet before him, down to a broad expanse of low country. At the precipice's base, the Nepean River, confined by high banks to a width of only 100 yards, roared tumultuously along its bed, strewn with immense rocks around which the water was churned into whitest foam. Far on either side, glorious glimpses of the winding river could be seen through the foliage, like a giant silver ribbon threaded through a tapestry of green and brown. Against the sky rose the sombre mountains, their rolling sides almost covered by the dark evergreen growths of New Holland, with here and there a naked peak rising boldly to sublimity. Between the precipice and the hills stretched nearly level woodland, broken in odd places by cultivated patches of varying sizes, sparsely studded with solitary farmhouses and cottages, and 1 or 2 hamlets distinguishable by their churches. Most of the houses were encircled by peach orchards, the delicate green of which made pleasing contrast with the sombre hue of the indigenous trees. The lofty tasselled tops of the blossoming maize swayed gracefully over acres of rich soil along the river bank, and Rashleigh was only recalled from the dream into which all this sudden beauty had plunged him by the fierce grasp of Foxley's fingers on his shoulder. "What are you mooning at?" he demanded, in a harsh, sneering tone. "Get a move on." Immediately his mood fell to resentful apathy, and not daring to think of beauty, he turned mechanically and followed the party as they set forward to penetrate more deeply among the hills. "Keep a sharp lookout now," warned Foxley in the early afternoon. "We're nearing the Great Western Road that leads over the hills to Bathurst. We've got to cross it somehow, and it's as like as not that there are guards or police knocking around, since they brought the prisoners up to build this new road. There's no knowing who's about. Wary now." Foxley had scarcely spoken when the bushrangers paused, alert at the sound of the shrill cry, called a coo-ee in the colony, which was used as a means of informing people of one's position and to seek guidance. While the party halted, listening attentively, the same voice repeated the cry thrice. Smith moved off alone in the direction whence the cry came to investigate, while the others plunged into the heart of the thicket. They had not waited long when they heard Smith's voice and another's, and Foxley immediately beckoned the others to join him and went to meet the 2 men. The newcomer was a short, thick-set man, about 50, decently dressed, and carried a stout walking stick. Smith introduced him. "This is Mr. Huggins, the overseer of No. 1 Iron Gang," he said. "He tells me he has lost his way hunting for bushrangers." Rashleigh saw the glint of malignant satisfaction in Foxley's eyes as he gruffly acknowledged the introduction, and shuddered at what it portended of a renewal of horror and suffering. Huggins himself seemed uneasy, and glanced apprehensively from one to the other of the bushrangers. "Well," said Foxley, after some moments of rumination, "I think I can put you in the way to find the bushrangers right soon. At any rate, Mr. Huggins, I can be certain of taking you home." The overseer missed the significance of the peculiar emphasis laid upon the last word, and accepted the proffered guidance. The whole party therefore set out to the west. Rashleigh, from the snatches of conversation between Foxley and the newcomer, was amazed to hear with what calm effrontery the leader described himself and his crew as bush constables belonging to Campbelltown, who had been sent in search of the notorious Foxley and his gang, then supposed to be lurking in the fastnesses of the Blue Mountains. Encouraged by this information, Huggins talked at length and eagerly of the urgent need of putting an end to the depredations of these infamous scoundrels. "If I could come across that swine Foxley," he concluded, "I would shoot him in his tracks like a dog." Foxley glanced over his shoulder at his confederates. At this sally, his features twisting into a grin of sardonic contempt, causing Smith and McCoy to grip their guns more tightly. So they walked on for about an hour before the length and direction of the journey began to rouse Huggins' suspicions. He questioned Foxley as to his certainty about the direction they were taking. To this he received the reply that they would be as safe as the bank directly. They had not proceeded much farther when, descending a very deep and rugged gully, Foxley tripped the man up and, as he fell, crashed down on top of him. The others came up quickly, and in a few minutes Huggins was bound securely hand and foot. Experience warned him of the trap into which he had fallen, and he at once began to beg for mercy, pleading with the hardened ruffians not to harm him. But, as he looked from one grim and grinning face to the other, he realized that there was as little hope of mercy from these men as from a herd of wild beasts. Foxley's only reply was to seize him by the collar and, assisted by one of his confederates, drag his new victim to the bottom of the gully, into which only the dimmest light could penetrate. They found, after some searching, a small level space where Foxley handed the prisoner over to Smith and McCoy, while he stood glaring at him with malignant cruelty. "As," he began presently, "as you have such a mighty great wish to see Philip Foxley, I think it would be a pity if so reasonable a desire shouldn't be granted." He paused a moment before declaring in a tone rasping with hate, "I am Foxley. Now, what do you think of me? Why don't you shoot me in my tracks? Like a dog, you talker? It's a great favour to see me and my mates." He went on sarcastically, "But we always take great care that those who have enjoyed the sight shan't tell anybody they've done so." Huggins seemed to shrink with fear before the concentrated venom of the man, and in his rapid terror began again to pour out supplications for mercy. "Shut up, you worm," cried McCoy. "Take a look at me. Don't you know me?" Huggins looked, but failed to recognize the man. "Aye, but you do know me," continued McCoy. "You know Sandy McCoy. It's not 12 months since I was under you, in your bloody gang. One day, when I wanted to see the doctor, you put me in the lock-up for 36 hours, handcuffed to a beam over my head, so that all my weight was on my wrists, and my toes just touching ground. Christ, if you forget, I remember. Now it's our turn, and you may as well say your prayers, for you're standing on your grave." "He did that trick on you, did he, McCoy?" said Foxley, and listening to his story, Rashleigh could understand the hard ruthlessness of the bushrangers. That's a common hobby of his and his kidney. Not a month since, one of his deputy overseers was tried for killing a poor devil who was sick, like you, and wanted to go to hospital. But Mr. Huggins ordered him to be triced up, and his deputy did as he was told, and left him there 2 days and 2 nights. The first night the deputy was told the man was dying, but he answered, "Let him die, and be damned too." So the next night, when the doctor came at last to see him, the poor devil was dead, stiff as a rod. That crawler, though he was committed, managed to get clear. But I'll take damn good care you don't escape from justice, you murdering swine, for I'm judge and jury in this here court, and I never acquitted a tyrant in my life." Huggins now threw himself on the ground in an agony of despair and terror, beating his head on the rock. Then he knelt to Foxley, alternating supplications with imprecations, until at length the leader of the gang broke out, "Blast the crying beggar. He'll make us all deaf. Gag him." As he spoke, Foxley suddenly leapt up and began to act like one demented. Swearing and roaring, he jumped about, rolled on the ground, and finally began to tear off his clothes until he stood stark naked, whereupon he recommenced his wild dancing antics, whistling, shouting, singing, hallooing, and swearing, all in a breath. It was some minutes before Smith, McCoy, and Rashleigh understood the cause of this quaint exhibition. The more to enjoy his triumph over Huggins, Foxley had sat down incautiously near a huge nest of ants, of a species vulgarly known in the colony as light horsemen. They are phenomenal pests, upward of 1.5 inches long, blue and green in colour, and are the fiercest and most virulent biters among all bush insects. While Foxley had sat still They had not molested him, but when he had moved they had stung him by scores, and now his body was smothered with swellings the size of hazelnuts. His companions judged how intense the pain must have been from the fact that he, who was then grimacing and yelling with pain, had been seen to endure the most severe floggings without so much as wincing. Foxley at last gathered up his clothes and shook them free from the ants, cursing the now prostrate Huggins as the cause of it all. "Blast you," he roared, with demoniac ferocity. "You can lie there, but I'll waken you with a vengeance before I'm done. Make me some ropes," he ordered the others with a snarl. He himself joined them in the task of improvising ropes out of a rolled bark lining, and when the cords were made, set about cutting and trimming a number of stakes, which he sharpened at the end. He then made Smith and McCoy gather all the logs and short timber lengths that they could find, while Rashleigh looked on, wondering what new diabolism was in preparation. The three bushrangers approached Huggins and stripped him of every stitch of clothing and dragged him, despite all his violent resistance, over to the ant bed. Then Rashleigh understood. They were going to tie the man down and leave him to one of the most dreadful deaths ever conceived by the debased imagination of man. He began to beg Foxley to desist, using every argument that his frenzied mind could lay hold of, finally reminding the outlaw that sooner or later his turn to suffer for the crimes he committed must come. Fear or premonition made the brute's patience give way. He turned upon Rashleigh with a thunderous roar. "Hold your damned tongue, you blasted crawling scum, or else I'll lay you alongside of him. I know damn well that if I'm taken alive I shall swing. Meanwhile I'll live to be revenged on such bloody tyrants as this." This outburst was followed by the others of as violent and vicious an intensity from Smith and McCoy. In realizing that his protests could do nothing but increase the tragic horror, he walked away and turned his back on the gruesome scene. Very soon a piercing scream startled him so that he involuntarily turned round. They had placed Huggins on the ant bed, and the excruciating pain of the first legion of stings from the enraged insects had lent him Herculean strength, and he had broken from his captors and began to run. McCoy flung a stone at him, which, catching him between the shoulders, felled him. "Hi, you!" yelled Foxley at Rashleigh. "Come and help get this dog tied up." He had no alternative but to obey, except the death to which they had condemned Huggins, and so Rashleigh was obliged to carry the particularly senseless man back to the ant heap. The ants were angered and scared by the second thud of his body, and in a few moments had completely covered him. The bushrangers began coolly to tie the wretched man down with cords fastened to the stakes which Foxley had prepared, securing him as firmly as the Lilliputians did Gulliver. The agony which he was suffering from the myriad bites of the swarming ants set him struggling like a madman, but the only effects of his efforts were that he still more infuriated the ants, and tightened the bonds against which he struggled. Rashleigh was dizzy with sickness, and fell to the ground in a faint, striking his head upon a sharp stone. Almost instantly he recovered consciousness, and was allowed to go, under the guidance of McCoy, in search of water. After a prolonged search, they found enough for their immediate purposes, and he prepared a meal of what remained of their provisions. Presently Foxley and Smith came up, and the leader, noticing how scanty was the fare, swore that had he known how depleted was their larder, he would have cut a stake off Huggins's body before giving it as a meal to the ants. Rashleigh could not suppress an expression of mingled incredulity and disgust at the loathsome suggestion. "Aye, softly," said the brutal Foxley. "I tell you, there isn't a tastier morsel in this world than the heart of a tyrant." For a bitter instant Rashleigh was tempted to retort that Foxley should himself make the most toothsome meal that ever could be cooked, but checked himself in time. After supper the party lay down to rest, and started out again at an early hour in the morning towards the western road, whence they had come after meeting the luckless Huggins. They passed the spot where he had been tied to the ant-heap, and Rashleigh was swept with nausea again to see that nothing but the untouched head and the clean stripped bones remained of the thick-set overseer. To this kind of end did the criminal penal code lead, for undoubtedly, he reflected, the man would never have been killed but for the fact that he had been so brutal in his punishment of McCoy, and Foxley himself had suffered at the hands of other overseers before making his escape. Chapter 15. When they approached the western road, McCoy was sent forward to reconnoitre, carrying with him a pistol, a pair of handcuffs, and a letter which had been found upon Huggins, whose clothes he wore. Foxley instructed him, in the event of his being met and questioned, to pass himself off as a constable who had been sent from Penrith with a letter from Overseer Huggins. McCoy returned after about 2 hours and reported the way clear. The whole party then recrossed the road, wandering all that day without food in the vicinity of the road, until after nightfall McCoy was again sent off, this time to procure eatables somehow from a station which they knew to be not far off. Rashleigh, worn out by hunger and fatigue, fell asleep, and far into the night was awakened by Foxley. "Rouse up and bear a hand," he was ordered, "and eat that." Rubbing his eyes, Rashleigh found a piece of bread and a chunk of raw salt meat, and began to eat, knowing that it was too dangerous to light a fire for cooking so close to the road. As soon as they had fed, he was handcuffed to Smith, whose arms had been taken from him, in accordance with the newly evolved scheme that they should masquerade as prisoners in charge of Foxley and McCoy, en route for the Penrith lock-up. They now went boldly along the road, and at the end of the 2nd mile, Rashleigh recognised a place as Lapstone Hill, the most easterly of the Blue Mountains, and not far distant from his old quarters at Emu Plains. At the foot of the hill they found 2 drays standing, under which, according to practice, the drivers were encamped. With the draught oxen grazing nearby, the sham constables marched their prisoners up to the campfire, ordered them to halt, and asked the 4 men who had emerged, at the yelping of their 2 dogs, whether they could get a drink of water. "Just wait a few minutes," responded one of the draymen, "and we'll make you some tea." "My mate and me don't care about tea," said Foxley, "but if you've a mind to give these poor devils a prisoner's a drop, I dare say they'd be glad of it before they get to their journey's end in Chocky. If that's where they're bound for, God's pity on them," said the kindly bullock driver, as he set an iron pot on the fire to boil water. The whole group now sat round the fire, and helped to get ready a feed for the travellers. With the hospitality which was customary in a mode of life in which all peaceable persons were at the mercy of the bands of armed plunderers on the highway, such men as these bullock drivers were at pains to ingratiate themselves always with the convict classes, so that they might get a good name among them. It was with this end in view that, while the constables were treated with just ordinary civility, Smith and Rashleigh were supplied with pipes and tobacco with which to indulge themselves while the food was being prepared. The bullock drivers, while their guests were eating, inquired as to the charge against the prisoners. McCoy replied with the prearranged story. "They are bolters," he said, "belonging to that gang of Foxley, the bushranger, but they won't split on his whereabouts, but will very soon have him along of them." And the name of the dreaded bushranger aroused the drivers to a pitch of excitement which was a tribute to that scoundrel's reputation. Was Foxley near here? How long since he was heard of? Which way do you think he was making? What was the latest crime he'd done? To all these questions McCoy replied circumstantially, saying that Foxley was thought to be somewhere near Bathurst, but had been reported as going back to the south, where he had lately been robbing the whole countryside. "He may be a great terror, this Foxley," he concluded in a bold tone, "but I only wish me and my mate could come across him. We'd show him." "For my part," said the elder of the bullock drivers, "I'd like to make a child's bargain with this Foxley. Let be for let be, for folks do say as he's a regular devil, a very fire-eater, and anyways, as you know, it don't do for us folks that's on the road to be meeting with gentry of that sort." "Och blotheration to such clack," struck in a bright-looking Irishman. "What a clatter you make about Foxley, as if no one knew anything about him at all but yourself. Sure, and ain't Phil Foxley no other but my uncle's wife's sister's husband's sixth cousin, and didn't him and me used to be goosens together in old Ireland. Mark my words, he went on, looking directly at Foxley. If Phil was before me now, all that would be in it, he'd say at once, Murtagh Cassidy, me jewel, is it yourself? He'd treat me with the best he'd got, and so he would. Foxley was smiling with grim enjoyment of Cassidy's bluff, and whispered to McCoy, who nodded. But did you ever see Foxley since you came to this country? He asked the Irishman. Is it me see him? Retorted the other, unabashed. Fake's thin, Mr. Constable. Maybe it's wanting to trap me you are. I'll only tell you, though, that I've seen him a good many times in the country, but when and where I'll just not tell you. You can get no hold on me for that. Oh, I don't mean you any harm, said McCoy, but I'd like to know what size and look of the man he is. I've got a description of him from a runaway list, but that was took long ago, when he first came out. Och fakes, if it's your luck to take the poor boy prisoner, then God's will be done. What sort of man is he? Well, he's like myself, for we always used to be took for brothers when we was together. The bushrangers and Rashleigh himself were hard to put to it to suppress their smiles at this, since the speaker was red as a fox and not more than 7 stone, while Foxley was twice his weight and was swarthy as a Moor. A greater dissimilarity could hardly be conceived, and it was immediately obvious to them that the bullock driver's intention was simply to focus interest upon himself, and that he had never seen Foxley or even heard a description of him. I should just like to know whether there is a chance of falling in with this same Foxley, observed another bullock driver, for I could guess what to do in such a case. Indeed, broke in Foxley himself. Then I can promise you for practically certain that Phil Foxley is nearer this than my mate here thinks. I'm certain I've been close to him today, and I'll swear to be alongside him tonight. Well then, if he's as close as that, said the bullock driver, with a look of alarm, I'll just get my musket ready, and I'd advise you to do likewise, Jem. In Jem thereupon disappeared under the dray, and returned with 2 old military firelocks. Jim remarked that the charge had been so long in his gun he would draw it out, but Foxley, seeing that the screw on the end of the ramrod was broken, offered to do it for him. Meanwhile, McCoy had got possession of the other man's gun on the pretence of examining it. At a mutual sign, the 2 bushranger constables laid down the driver's weapons and immediately presented their own pieces at the astounded men, warning them to stand still on peril of their lives. For, added Foxley in a terrifying tone, I am Foxley the bushranger. As he said this, Murtagh Cassidy was stooping to light his pipe, and instantly dropped pipe and knife into the fire, leapt over the piled bullock's boughs, yokes and chains, and made off at the speed of a hunted deer. McCoy took aim, but Foxley, roaring with laughter, knocked up the barrel. How he runs away from his relation, he cried, tears of merriment running from his hard eyes. Come back, you fool, to your 6th cousin Phil. He won't. Then blast him. Let him run, for he can't get help within 3 miles. He's too damn scarified, anyhow, to look for help where it might be found. The bushrangers now robbed the bullock drivers of everything worth taking and looted everything of use to them from the drays, after which they were led by Foxley by a circuitous route until they reached the foot of the mountains, where they had washed by the Nepean River at the northern extremity of Emu Plains. Here, just at dawn, they halted and enjoyed the first square meal they had had for 48 hours, and then proceeded to examine their plunder. They had acquired half a chest of tea, a bag of Moriarty's sugar, a basket of Brazilian tobacco, and a quantity of clothing, shawls and handkerchiefs, as well as a supply of flour and pork, which ensured them against a renewal of famine for at least a week. The greater part of the day was spent in sleep, but at dusk McCoy was again dispatched to spy out the land. Very soon he returned, and led them to a spot on the riverbank, where was a large bark canoe which he had stolen from a settler's wharf. And into this they got and paddled for some hours, keeping as much as possible under the shade of the mountains. and on the uninhabited side of the river. Occasionally, the unavoidable noise made by the paddles set the farmers' dogs running along the bank, barking so ferociously that their masters and mistresses were aroused and made their appearance on the high opposite bank, peering across the river with the light of bark torches and hailing to know who was on the river. The lights they carried blinded them to everything outside the radius of their glare, and the bushrangers passed on unmolested until the dawning of day warned them to resume their hiding. They ran the canoe into the reeds, unloaded her, and, having carefully concealed their cargo, penetrated to a fastness and slept. In the evening, the three bushrangers had a conference, and at the end of which Smith was left in charge of Rashleigh, while the other two set off towards the river. Rashleigh learnt from Smith that their hiding place was in the North Rocks near Richmond, and that the other bushrangers had gone off to dispose of the plunder. They returned late in the morning and gathered all the goods together in readiness for the appearance of the purchaser, who was expected at any moment. This man, when he appeared, Rashleigh found to be none other than the district constable, a fellow notorious throughout the colony as the Scrooge of all petty offenders. He was known as Sobersides, and had some years ago received his discharge as a prisoner. At first he had endeavoured to become the toughest flashman in his district, being notable as the hardest living scamp in the whole population, but he suddenly turned hypocritically pious, dropped his evil language and habits outwardly, and drew wool so thickly over the eyes of authority that the village parson appointed him his clerk and sexton, and the village magistrate gave him the position of district constable. From behind this palisade of respectability, he became wealthy as a fence and receiver, and by accumulating bribes from his clients and other offenders, yet outwardly acting the part which he had with such diabolical shrewdness assumed. So subtle and safe were the means which he adopted to maintain his dual role of guardian and breaker of the law, that Foxley and his confederates all wore masks when he appeared, as they did not trust him to recognize them. Knowing how deep was his capacity for double dealing, the deal was speedily made, after which they retreated to the still more secure hiding place, where Smith and Rashleigh were ordered to keep a lookout while Foxley and McCoy slept. At the upper end of the valley, known as North Rocks, the face of its walls is cut by many chasms, and it was in one of these that the outlaws went into a retreat. Its entrance was low, but within it was a commodious place from 10 to 12 feet high, and its sandstone floor was quite dry except for a corner in which dropping water had hollowed a basin 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep, constantly filled with clear cold water. In the roof was a rift in the rock, open to the sky, but so overgrown with brush that it was practically invisible from above or below, yet sufficient light percolated through it to light the cavern. At night they carried the goods which Sobersides had agreed to purchase to the river bank, and presently he came alone in a boat and paid for them. The goods were transferred into the boat, which made off, and the three bushrangers stood apparently in earnest consultation, which ended in their turning abruptly towards the river. On the bank they paused, while McCoy carefully searched the reeds, coming back presently with a catamaran, in which they quickly crossed the stream, taking Rashleigh with them. They climbed the high opposite bank, and he heard the hum of voices directly in their route. Foxley and McCoy walked closely on either side of him, and they went on in silence until most of the houses were left behind. Whilst the other three halted, McCoy went forward alone, returning to beckon the whole party forward to a house standing by itself. Lights were burning in the rooms, and a female voice was heard singing. Foxley knocked upon the door, and the whole party was admitted. A young and handsome Australian woman greeted McCoy with kisses, and the whole party entered a typical spacious settler's living room, in which there were many evidences that the occupants were living in easy circumstances. In a few minutes, two other girls and an elderly man and woman came in, and all welcomed the visitors with obvious friendliness, pressing food upon them which they declined. Rashleigh noticed McCoy take one of the girls aside and after some conversation give her money. She went out immediately, while Foxley and Smith carried on a cheery talk with the other two girls. The girl returned with a keg on her head, and was enthusiastically greeted by the whole party, who all, excepting Rashleigh, drew up to the table and settled down to cards and rum drinking. On entering, Foxley had ordered Rashleigh to sit in a certain place in the room, threatening to shoot him dead if he made any move to change his place. At the other table, his companions were rapidly growing drunk and noisy, and the room was ringing with songs and roistering. Presently, Foxley, after eyeing Rashleigh morosely, got up and staggered over to him. "Why in the hell aren't you drinking?" he demanded thickly. "Think you're too much of a gentleman for my company?" In vain was it that Rashleigh pointed to a teacup which he had just emptied of rum and water, and assured Foxley that he had been drinking every time his cup had been filled. "A teacup!" hiccuped the outlaw. "To the devil with such a shell as a teacup!" He lumbered over to the fireplace, seized an empty quart pot, and, after spilling a great deal of liquor, at length filled it with rum from the keg. He handed the filled pot to Rashleigh. "Here, damn and blast your miserable snivelling carcass. Take this and drink it up directly. I'll see you don't keep sober while we get drunk, so that you can go and bring the traps to nobble us. Go on, drink that lot at once." Rashleigh remonstrated, but Foxley responded by cocking a pistol and holding it against his head. "Drink, you bugger, or die," he shouted menacingly. So the luckless fellow took the pot and began to drink the raw, strong spirit, and every time he paused for breath, Foxley pressed the cold barrel against his temple. "Down with every drop," he yelled. Rashleigh, feeling as though his insides were on fire, had to drink, and as he drained the pot, he heard a savage laugh in his ears, and sank insensible to the floor. When he recovered consciousness, he was raving with thirst, and his whole body was in an agony of acute distress. He tried to rise, but fell back instantly. He tried to speak, but could not, and he lay in burning torture, unable to move. But with his brain uncannily clear, he heard Foxley's voice talking, and a female voice answering. They must have been aroused by Rashleigh's fall, for presently their alarm quietened, and their conversation took another turn, from which he gathered that the woman, who was evidently in bed with the bushranger in this room, was trying to impress upon Foxley's drink-mused mind the magnitude of the booty he could get if he would only follow her advice about some enterprise of which she must have been speaking before the interruption. "If you really loved me, Phil," he heard her say, "would you let me go about it in a print dress? While that staunchy bitch, Nancy Doughboy, has a silk gown. Here's your chance to prove you really love me. Go to it." "I'll get you a whole wardrobe, pretty," said Foxley, maudlin. While other sounds took the place of speech, Rashleigh's rum-bewildered brains were in a ferment of fear as to what new atrocity was contemplated, and at each new onslaught of the fumes appalling delusions of demons and furies seemed to sweep around and through his tortured being, taunting him with his cowardliness in being associated with such devils incarnate as the man in bed with a troll and his associates. Better to die then. Pain shooting through his limbs and throbbing at his temples banished coherent thought, and dreams of hell and damnation thronged his imagination through hours of pain. It was before dawn next morning that the bushrangers, dragging Rashleigh with them, left the house to return to their lair. In his weakness, he had to brace himself with a draught of rum before he could revive in his poisoned body enough energy to move from the room, and as he stumbled through the darkness with his tyrannical companions, he prayed for death to end his sufferings. He was still under the effects of his gargantuan draught of spirits when Foxley awakened him at the end of a day's troubled sleep, and ordered him harshly to rise and come along with the others. The moon in her first quarter was just above the trees as they set out upon what Rashleigh, with last night's overheard conversation in his mind, little doubted was an adventure even more nefarious than those he had already unwillingly shared. Foxley went forward with more than his customary caution, and the reason was clear in the almost continuous baying of house dogs, which proves the district to be well populated. They trudged for some hours in silence, coming at last to a large clearing, in the centre of which was a cluster of huts in darkness. The marauders walked boldly up to these, and lifting the latch, walked into the main building, closing the door behind them just in time to prevent the house dogs from leaping after them. As McCoy secured a light, a man in his nightshirt came out of an inner room into that in which the group of 4 men were standing, grumbling drowsy imprecations on the noisy hounds which had disturbed his sleep before he knew that he was not alone. Foxley's hand was on his shoulder and his pistol muzzle pressed against his forehead. The men started and began to cry out, when Foxley whispered harshly, "Silence, or I'll drive a brace of bullets through your skull." Driving the householder to the other side of the room, he demanded to be told what other men were asleep in the house. "Only my 2 sons and a stranger," was the reply. "Where are they?" "In yonder," replied the old man, who was shaking as with a goo, it's like a chill, pointing to a door other than that from which he had emerged. Foxley, leaving Smith in charge of the settler, went with McCoy into the room, and Rashleigh heard his rude voice arousing the inmates, and in a few moments 3 men in their shirts were driven in to stand beside the first prisoner. "Now call your wife and daughters out here," Foxley ordered the old man, "and mind if there's any more men, even another one, I'll shoot him dead with all the rest of you." The women, pale, disordered, and trembling, made their appearance, and McCoy encouraged them to have no fear, as he said that no harm was intended to their personal safety. Foxley confirmed this assurance, and ordered the women to prepare food for his party. The women went to do his bidding, and Foxley turned to the settler, who stood motionless, suppressing his natural indignation at the outrage that was being put upon his household. "Well, Mr. Shanavan," said the outlaw, "I've been told that you came up from Sydney the other day with a big swag of property, and I've called for my good share of it. You look slippy, and bring it out here to the light, and mind you bring every mortal thing, for if you don't I shall know, and I'll flog you within an inch of your life. Where is it?" The old man paused, looking round helplessly for some moments. "In my bedroom," he managed to stammer out at last. "Then come with me," commanded Foxley, in a tone which made the settler take the lamp and lead the way into the bedroom. Smith, meanwhile, had been looking steadfastly into the face of the stranger, who had come in with the settler's sons, who seemed considerably disconcerted by the bushranger's scrutiny, repeatedly changing his position in an attempt to avoid the other's gaze. Foxley returned with the settler, from whom McCoy took the wearing apparel and other goods which he had been forced to bring out, and Smith at once addressed him. "I say, Foxley, who do you think we have nailed at last?" "Sure, I don't know. Who is it?" replied the leader, at the same time taking steady stock of the stranger, who deliberately hid his face from view. Smith stepped forward, laid hold his ear, and turned his head round with a sudden jerk. "Come, Mr. MacGuffin," he said, in tones of coarse sarcasm, "let's have a look at your pretty mug. You didn't used to be so bashful." Foxley let out a savage roar of triumph. "Why, 'tis Mr. MacGuffin, the tyrant," he cried in incredulous tones. "You may as well call him that," said Smith. "Why, the last time I ever saw him, he flogged our whole gang, 15 of us, 50 lashes each for the working hands and 100 for the overseer, without us being charged with any crime at all, and without the shadow of a trial. And when Jack Bunn, the overseer, and as good a man as ever broke bread, asked what the flogging was for, this scum answered, 'Why, to keep the hair out of your eyes.'" Never had Rashleigh seen such hate flashed in any man's eyes as shone then in Smith's. "Aye, I know him well by report," Foxley remarked. "Ain't he the beautiful inspector of falling parties that Major Fireplace got power for from the governor, that he might flog any or all men in the gangs under him without bringing them to court? And hasn't he gone on horseback about the country with a flogger at his heels like a running footman, serving out stripes to all and sundry? And now, my gentleman, I've got you, and I mean to see if I can't wipe off all scores with you. You've served out your last floggings. The intensity of passionate hate in the bushranger's tone seemed at first to appall MacGuffin, a tall, weather-beaten, swarthy man with unusually stern features. But by the close of the leader's tirade, he recovered his nerve and self-possession. "Well, you infernal, cold-blooded, murdering, treacherous ruffian," he said, giving better than he had got. "Ruffian! Ooh! And what can you do, after all, but only take my life, and that you may do and be damned? Yes, I have had hundreds of such loathsome, crawling slugs as you and your mob flogged, and I've one comfort left yet, and that is to neither God nor man can keep you much longer from the gallows, for the devil has almost done with you, and Jack Ketch must soon get his due in choking you and your loblolly boys, loblolly boys. So you may do your worst. I defy you." That paragraph, that's definitely been rewritten. This front of indomitable boldness seemed to paralyse the bushrangers, though almost at his first word, Foxley had deliberately cocked a pistol and levelled it at MacGuffin's head. As he went on, Foxley seemed to hesitate in his purpose, though the gathering storm on his brow revealed the deepening intensity of his rage, while Smith and McCoy stood gaping as though under the enchantment of the prisoner's audacity. The instant MacGuffin ceased speaking, however, McCoy, suddenly livid with the tide of rage, felled him with a blow from the butt end of his musket, at which a loud shriek burst from one of the onlooking girls, who sank senseless to the floor. "Now, by all my hopes of a black revenge," said Foxley, "I'm glad you knocked the bragging bully down, for I was on the point of shooting him, and it would have been 10,000 pities he should get so easy a death." "Is he hurt much?" McCoy bent down and assured his leader that he was only stunned. "What ails that girl?" demanded Foxley of the settler's wife. "She was frightened for her lover," answered the shaking woman. "Her lover?" queried Foxley, a diabolical light in his eyes. "Yes, they are soon to be married." Foxley crashed his hand on the table with a gesture of evil glee. "Better and better! This is glorious!" he roared. "Boys, we shall have capital sport presently. Bring the wench round as quickly as possible." He paced the floor with hurried, uneven strides, as if labouring under some extraordinary excitement. "McCoy, throw a bucket of water over that grovelling beast," he commanded. "And now, mistress, let us have supper directly." MacGuffin, revived by the douche of water, was bound fast to a millpost on one side of the room, and the bushrangers then tied the father and his sons into a kind of bundle, so that they could not move a limb. The bushrangers then sat down to supper, facing the prisoners, and invited Rashleigh to join them. He, however, was suffering from such nausea that he declined to eat. He had apprehended Foxley's horrible intention to commit an atrocity infinitely worse than any he had yet fouled his soul with, and he sat shivering with dread, and longing for a means to escape from a scene which would be unendurable. Yet he was completely awed by the threatening looks and gestures which Foxley kept directing towards him. The ruffian insisted upon being served by MacGuffin's betrothed on her knees, and tasting everything on the table, goading and insulting her cruelly. "You'd best keep me in a good temper," he jeered, giving her an obscene embrace. "Your superfine scoundrel that you've chosen for your husband is in my hands. You'll never bed with him unless you're kind to me." After supper, the women were forced to set spirits before the callous ruffians, and Foxley ordered one of the girls to fill a hopper of the steel mill with wheat. McCoy then partially unbound MacGuffin and ordered him to grind the grain. "I'll see you all in hell first," said the prisoner tersely. Foxley leapt up. "Oh, you mutiny, do you? I'll test how game you are." He secured a stirrup leather, tore MacGuffin's shirt from his back, leaving him stark naked before men and women, and began to beat him with the heavy buckle end. MacGuffin struggled valiantly, but was unable to free himself from the skilfully knotted bonds, and fell back upon taunting his tormentor with words which cut into his vanity as deep as buckle into his own back. "Hit, man, for heaven's sake. Why, you couldn't knock a sprat off a gridiron. You couldn't brush a fly off your mother's nose." Foxley, enraged, laid on with redoubled fury, lacerating the man's back until the blood ran in a stream to the ground, until he was compelled to leave off from lack of breath and strength. "Ah, you cowardly beast," MacGuffin went on. "I knew from your looks that you were nothing but a flogger. The first time ever I set eyes on you, and you can't say that I ever flogged a man myself in my life." Foxley, almost gnashing his teeth with rage at this sarcastic reproach, for a flogger was on a parallel with a hangman in New South Wales, flung down the stirrup leather and, muttering something about being deeply revenged, left him. As he went back to his place at the table, his glance took in the two sobbing girls clinging to their mother. He was almost inanimate with fear and horror, and Rashleigh saw again the flash of triumphant diabolism in his eyes. "Ha!" Foxy shouted. "I have it." He sprang suddenly upon MacGuffin's betrothed and tore her out of her mother's arms. "McCoy, you take the other girl, and Smith, push the old bitch into the bedroom, and see she doesn't get out." Feebly resisting and pouring out moving entreaties, the mother was rushed brutally from the room, while the girls struggled against the loathsome embraces of the two bushrangers. Rashleigh's cowed manhood suddenly flamed, and he rushed at Foxley, begging him to be merciful, to remember his mother, his sisters, and tried to wrench the almost fainting girl from the arms of the sinister devil, who was intent upon shaming her in front of her lover. Foxley struck him full in the forehead with the butt end of his pistol, and thus saved him from being an eyewitness of the ruffianly defloration of the two innocent girls. When consciousness returned, it was over. The girls lay sobbing uncontrolledly where the bushrangers had flung them, and MacGuffin's limbs were raw and bleeding where the bonds had bitten him against his wild straining. His face was set and deadly pale, and in his eyes was a look that turned Rashleigh's heart to water. As he got to his feet, Smith asked him whether he was content to mind his own business, or did he want the night's sport to finish with a blue bullet in his head. "Go on, do," shouted Rashleigh, almost insane with the disgust at the wretchedness of the life he was compelled to lead. "Shoot me, and make an end of it all. As well die that way as by the rope." "What's all this?" demanded Foxley, turning. "Only this jackass is tired of life," answered Smith, "and I think it'd be a damn good thing to finish it for him." "Not on your life you don't," said the chief. "The crawling beggar shan't get out of our clutches as easy as that. He's going to wish himself dead 100 times before we're done with him." Foxley pushed him through the door and drove him before him to a neighbouring open hovel, where a horse stood. "Saddle that beast, and lead it to the house," he ordered. When the horse was ready, and the two with the horse had returned to the house, Foxley called to McCoy to bring out MacGuffin, who came out with his hands fast tied behind his back. Foxley now mounted the horse, and Rashleigh was ordered to take up a great bundle of plunder and bring it along. He resolutely refused to do this, his reawakened manhood being proof against the kicks and blows which Smith and McCoy rained upon him. At last they bound the bundle to his back, and fastened him securely to Foxley's stirrup by the wrists. MacGuffin had been left standing alone during this episode, and Rashleigh saw the outraged girl who was to marry him slip out of the house with a knife in her hand, and cut the cord which bound her lover's arms. Swiftly they disappeared through the door, which was instantly shut. Foxley, who was busy directing the others in the securing of Rashleigh, looked up just as the door shut. 10,000 devils seized the scoundrel. "He's gone," he yelled, digging his heels into his horse's flanks. The animal was young and leaped forward in alarm at the sudden summons, dragging Rashleigh along the ground for some yards, then plunging and rearing with fright, flung Foxley over its head just as the stirrup leather snapped and freed Rashleigh. It then bolted off at top speed. Foxley leapt to his feet unhurt and saw that MacGuffin, who had fled through the house, was nearly at the river's bank, running frantically. The three bushrangers discharged their muskets together, but MacGuffin raced on unharmed. Foxley and McCoy started after him, leaving Smith in charge of Rashleigh, whom the bushranger began to beat with the butt of his gun, while swearing that he had only made the trouble he did to give MacGuffin a chance to escape. The runaway reached the bank and plunged in just as the bushrangers fired again, and before they had time to reload and fire a third volley, he had climbed out on the opposite bank and, with a loud shout of defiance, dived into a thicket and disappeared from view. Foxley and McCoy returned slowly to the house, their expressions sullen as thunder at being thwarted. They fell fiercely upon Rashleigh and beat him, as though he was the cause of their outwitting. "There, blast him. I think that'll do for now," panted Foxley at last, "and anyhow, we'd best make tracks before we have the whole of Richmond on us." The spoil was divided in 4 parts, each carrying his share, and the party went quickly to the riverside, plunged amongst the tall reeds, and began to force their way along the bank, often up to the waist in water. McCoy advising this route as they would leave no trace, and no one would dream of looking for them there. For hours they toiled along, until at last they came to a great tree, which had long since fallen into the river, but the water being shallow, many of its limbs were still above the surface of the stream, though so much overgrown with reeds as to be invisible from the bank. Here the fugitives rested, and Rashleigh, tucking himself into a fork of 2 limbs, stretched his bruised and weary body and slept for some time. His rest was broken by dreadful dreams in which he fancied himself locked in mortal struggle with Foxley, whom he had almost overpowered when McCoy gripped him by the throat and, presenting a pistol to his head, inflicted a painful wound, the anguish of which awakened him to find that Smith's hand actually was on his throat. He made wild gestures, pointing to the shore, and motioned him to shift silently and cautiously to a place of more secure concealment. His new hiding place was almost completely screened from the bank, but he could himself see through the close fence of reeds, and he saw what explained Smith's silent urgency. There were a number of armed men quite close, one of whom, mounted on horseback, he recognized as MacGuffin, with whom was standing Shanavan's 2 sons, one of whom he heard assuring the rest of the party that he could swear that he had glimpsed a man down there in the reeds. "If you think there is anyone there," came his brother's voice, "let's fire a volley, and it's 10 to 1 that one of our bullets will tell, or at any rate make him sing out." This advice was evidently approved, for in a few moments there was a discharge of fully 20 muskets, and balls rattled close to the party of bushrangers. Foxley seemed to have been struck, for Rashleigh saw him change colour and sway, as if about to fall from the position in which he cowered. The leaping hope that the tyrant was dead was short-lived, however, for the leader clenched his teeth and tightened his grasp on the bough that upheld him. The search party moved off, firing into the reeds from time to time, whenever anything moved beneath them. It was very late in the night before the bushrangers at last ventured out and cautiously made their way back to the cabin in the North Rocks. Here they found awaiting them the 3 young women at whose house they had recently spent the night, and who had been there awaiting their return since before dawn on the previous day. These wantons, the vanity of one of whom had been the cause of the whole blackguardly expedition, were actually waiting for a share of the spoils. Their love of finery had made them envious of the fine clothes which it was known had been bought for the approaching Shanavan wedding, and they had incited Foxley and McCoy to plunder their rivals. The raid had been successful for the women, and when the articles of apparel were laid out before the admiring and acquisitive eyes, they broke into an avalanche of appreciation and gratitude to the men who had risked their lives and plunged to such depths of human infamy to gratify their wishes. A meal was prepared, and the whole party sat round while Foxley gave the women a circumstantial account of all that had happened, dwelling in obscene detail upon the rape of the Shanavan girls, winning shrieks of applauding laughter from the strumpets. "Those Shanavan girls, then," remarked one of them, "won't be able in future to hold their cocky heads so high when they meet our sort that's fond of sweethearting for its own sake." Rashleigh was amazed at the depravity shown by these pretty girls, who seemed utterly lost to all sense of womanly shame. He had heard of such victims of the conditions imposed upon the convict classes, amongst which the long-continued evil habits of the parents had produced an indifference to virtue and an induration to vice. But this was his first encounter with the living human results. The night wore on in a scene of growing indiscretion, until Rashleigh, consigned to a distant corner of the cabin, saw the women attach themselves to the men to spend the night in the way which their upbringing and heredity had taught them was sensible and natural. Despite his fatigue, sleep came hardily to him that night, for he was oppressed with the sense of humanity befouled and the ideals bedunged. Chapter 16. It was broad daylight when the desperados were awakened by the loud baying of hounds. As they stood tense and listening, they heard voices and realized that they were beset by pursuers who knew that Foxley was in the cabin. The voice of a man who seemed to be in authority was heard quietening the hounds, and then to ask if anyone knew what manner of cave it was. Another voice answered that it was a large place, but that it had only the one outlet. The leading man's voice came again, shouting, "Foxley, we know you are there. Come out now, for we will carry the hill away in handfuls if need be. What have you this time we will?" None of the bushrangers replied, but all busied themselves loading their guns and took up positions at the side where they could command the lower entrance, to come through which a man must creep on hands and knees. Several times the summons to surrender was repeated, but Foxley and his comrades remained dumb. Then a figure was seen slowly worming its way in. Rashleigh, unarmed, watched fascinated until the head came into sight, and his ears rang for minutes with the terrific impact of the explosion of the 3 muskets, which his captors fired simultaneously, which was detonating in the enclosed space. When the smoke had cleared, he saw that the head had been only a cap stuck on the end of a pole, swathed in old clothes, which had evidently been pushed through with a view to discovering whether the opening was free of obstacles. A loud, gleeful shout came to them from outside at the success of the stratagem. "Come on out now, Foxley," came the leader's voice again. "If you don't, we'll smoke you out like rats." "You can try and be damned to you," growled Foxley. The man was as good as his word, and in a few minutes clouds of smoke came pouring through the entrance into the cabin, filling it so rapidly that the inmates had to fling themselves flat on their faces, pressing their mouths and noses close to the ground to avoid suffocation. The terrified women managed to keep silent in their alarm, and presently they and the men found a part of the cabin far back beyond the narrow slit which served as a chimney, where they were free of the smoke. The fire was kept replenished for about 2 hours before the volume of smoke pouring in diminished, and voices were heard speculating as to whether anyone was still alive within. The cap and pole ruse was repeated, but this time the bushrangers ignored it, and it was withdrawn. Next a volley of musketry was discharged through the opening, but no one was hit, as the bushrangers, anticipating some such action, were lying on the floor. The attackers grew bolder and more determined. Rashleigh saw 3 figures crawling through the opening, one a little in advance of the other 2. Foxley was on his feet and slipped over to the side of the entrance, and the instant the first head showed, crushed in the skull with a blow from the butt end of his musket. At the same time, Smith and McCoy fired at the dead man's companions, whose screams of pain were a signal for them to be drawn back by their friends outside, the dead body being left in the entrance. Foxley ordered the others to lie down and fire with him through the opening. After this, only a mutter of voices could be heard, but the fire was relighted and again smoke came pouring in. Foxley stood gazing up at the rift in the roof, and calling McCoy to him, the two began to fashion pegs from the remaining firewood, which they drove into the sides to form hand and foothold for climbing. When this job was completed, Foxley went up and disappeared through the overgrown rift. After some minutes he returned, obviously in high glee, and came swiftly down to the cabin floor. "Thanks to old Nick, Sophie," he said, pinching one of the girl's ears. "We can all get out of this trap as easy as kiss your hand. I've been right up to the top," he went on, a trace of excitement in his tone, "and I could see all those beggars below busy heaping wood on their damn fire, but they couldn't see me, and there's a gully only 100 yards from this hole. If we can only get there unseen, we are as safe as a bank." Without wasting a moment, he gave his orders, going up first himself, so that he could help the women who followed, with McCoy behind to give him a heave from below. Rashleigh came next, loaded with food, and Smith brought up the rear. Immediately they were through, the women disappeared, and after pausing a few moments to listen to the noises made by their intending captors, the bushrangers with Rashleigh made their way swiftly along the gully and did not pause until they had put the hill between them and their assailants. On they went without halt or rest through the desolate country, without meeting a soul all day. At nightfall they flung themselves down to rest in the gloomy recesses of a rocky ravine, not daring even yet to light a fire for the preparation of food. Fear of discovery obsessed them, and the gleam of a fire might have betrayed their retreat. In the dead of night, Rashleigh was awakened by Foxley's voice. "Help! Murder!" he was yelling. "I'm choking! Take his hand from my throat! Oh!" They went to him in a body and found him in some sort of a fit, his eyes wide open, foam flecking his lips, his teeth gnashing, and incoherent, muttering sounds coming from his throat. They got water and flung it over him, but no sooner had this revived him partially than he leapt up and ran off at full speed. McCoy, warning Smith to look after Rashleigh, set off after their chief, whom they all thought must have gone suddenly mad. Smith, with blows and curses, drove Rashleigh before him in the wake of the others. The mad rush went on throughout a day and night, Foxley going ahead as if all the devils in hell were after him, forcing the others to follow at his own tiring pace. At last they halted on the edge of the valley of the Comoroy, over 100 miles from the scene of the outrage upon the Shanavans. The whole party were completely exhausted by their flight, and to add to their miseries, the weather suddenly broke and settled down into a heavy deluge of rain. Thunder crashed, and the forked lightning brought great trees thudding to earth, threatening their lives at any moment. The shelterless wretches were without even the means of stripping a sheet of bark, the ordinary resource of Australian bushmen, while they were entirely unable to start a fire. Unendurably fatigued, they had no recourse but to take what rest they could on the swimming ground, or by leaning against trees which might at any moment be struck by the lightning. Their clothes were drenched, and all their food was spoilt, but these calamities and discomforts were as nothing compared with the miseries of utter weariness. Rashleigh, some time in the past, had read of a superstitious notion which had been prevalent in most countries in the Middle Ages, that great and callous criminals were at the limit of their devilry, cast off as unworthy of divine mercy, so that in the remainder of their lives they endure a foretaste of the doom of the damned after death. It was in this way, in the years that followed, that Rashleigh was inclined to interpret the astonishing and fearsome conduct of Philip Foxley during the 3 days which he spent in the Comoroy Mountains. His soul stained by repeated crimes against the entire Decalogue, his ruffian had lived apparently fearless of God or man, when suddenly he seemed to be cast into the very hell of remorse. A phrase of scripture, "The wicked flee when no man pursueth," occurred to Rashleigh. Foxley would sit staring with vacant eyes into space, and a strong, violent shuddering would come over his whole frame, and he would fall to the ground, raving that he was being choked. that hounds were tearing him piecemeal. 20 times a day, these and like terrifying conceits would set him in a panic. Smith and McCoy would resuscitate him as best they could, and then he would glare wildly at them and rush away with mad speed until his strength gave out or collision with some obstacle brought him to the ground. During these days, he spoke not one rational sentence. If either or both of his confederates went near him, he would fix his blank eyes upon them without recognition. When they sought to soothe him with friendly talk, his glare would grow wild, and suddenly he would leap up and rush upon them as if to smash them to earth. At the end of the third day, while Foxley was for a time quiet in his semi-conscious state, Rashleigh overheard a conversation between Smith and McCoy, from which he gathered that they had decided that their leader was hopelessly insane, and that they were deliberating as to the advisability of killing him. Smith's suggestion was that they should toss a coin to decide which of them should murder him, and then, the deed having been done, they should cut off Foxley's head and deliver it to the authorities with some plausible tale of the hardships the bearer had endured in capturing the notorious bushranger. This plan, he maintained, might ensure the pardon of one of them at least. For some time McCoy demurred, but at last consented to think over the scheme until morning. The rainstorm continued unabated, and the two plotters withdrew to the rough shelter of boughs which they had erected. Rashleigh had constructed a storm shelter of his own, with boughs thatched with leaves. It was not until the evening of the third day that he finished it, and when Smith and McCoy retired for the night, he lay down and slept like a dead thing until late in the morning of this fourth day of Foxley's madness. He was awakened by a tremendous hullabaloo, and, peeping through the walls of his shelter, he saw Foxley bleeding profusely and swearing vociferously, so that he thought that the crime plotted on the previous night had been committed. On investigation, however, he learnt that the bushranger had made one of his mad rushes, had tripped over a root and crashed down so that his temple had been gashed by a sharp-pointed stone. Smith and McCoy were trying to stem the flow of blood which poured from the wound, but it was not until Foxley had lost nearly 2 quarts of blood that their crude bandage had its effect. For 3 hours Foxley laid in a torpor. At the end of this time his eyes opened, and it seemed as though the shock had restored his reason. He asked McCoy in a soft, weak voice where they were and what day it was, and on being told the facts, seemed dumbfounded at the great distance they had travelled since they escaped from the besieged cavern. The rain had at last ceased, and as Foxley, after drinking a little water, sank immediately into a deep slumber, the others followed suit. They did not wake until the morning of the next day. They had had only one real meal since leaving the cavern, and Foxley, having been weakened by loss of blood, was wild for food. It was therefore decided to take the chance of finding a settlement in order to obtain provisions. They climbed the banks of Comaroy, trusting to come upon one of the stock of sheep stations which they knew to be dotted here and there to the right of the Bathurst country. It was not until the forenoon of the next day that, after travelling some hours southward along the river's course, they came upon a small hut and stockyard in the centre of a natural clearing. The door was opened, and smoke was coming from the chimney, and the bushrangers discussed how best they might approach unobserved and so surprise the inmates. In the end they made a circuit through the trees until they were opposite the back of the house. Foxley and Smith, taking only the guns and pistols, dropped flat and began to crawl cautiously through the grass. Rashleigh was left in McCoy's charge and lay behind a log, from which position he had a clear view of the hut and clearing. He watched the desperadoes stealthily approach and saw, just as they reached a corner of the stockyard, a man came out of the hut carrying a whip and going over to a stable shed from which he led out a horse, ready saddled and bridled. As his foot was in the stirrup, Foxley and Smith stood up and, covering him with their guns, ordered him to halt on peril of his life. The man, however, after a glance at them, vaulted lightly into the saddle, spurred his horse sharply and rode off. He passed within 20 yards of the bushrangers, who again roaring to him to stop without effect, fired simultaneously. The rider's hat was shot from his head, but he rode on apparently unwounded and was soon lost to view among the trees. The bushrangers reloaded their pieces and, calling to McCoy to bring Rashleigh with him, entered the hut. By the time Rashleigh, with his guard, reached the doorway, the 3 inmates were already on their knees before Foxley, who had them covered with a pistol in each hand, and was threatening them with instant death. Smith, with a look and a gesture, conveyed to McCoy his disgust at the way Foxley was conducting himself, and signed to Rashleigh's guard to shoot the leader in the back. But McCoy shook his head in vigorous dissent and approached Foxley. "I say, Phil," he said in a quiet voice, "don't work yourself up into a passion. It was food we came for. Let's make these crawlers get us a feed ready, for I'm damned hungry." "Is that you, Sandy?" asked Foxley, his eyes wild and glaring. "I thought these swine had got you, and I was just going to slaughter them for it." "Oh no," laughed McCoy. "I'm not taking yet. Come, get up, you fellows, and let's see what you've got to eat." The 3 trembling men sprang up and began to bustle about, preparing food for their unwelcome guests. One of them was very tall, and his expression was forbidding and lugubrious in the extreme, and upon him Foxley fixed his mad gaze, as if trying to recall where he had seen him before. "Hey, you great long fellow," he shouted, "what's your name?" The man started. "Allen." "William Allen is my name," he answered. "You lie, blast you," roared Foxley. "You're Long Hempenstall, that used to hang the rebels long ago in Ireland." "I'm sure I'm not, sir," replied the terrified stockman. "I never was in Ireland in my life." "Now look you, Sandy," said Foxley to McCoy. "Ain't it a hard case that such a long crawling caterpillar should try to make me out a liar? I tell you," he went on, glaring at Allen, "you are the walking gallows. I heard my father talk about you when I was little, how you used to go about with ropes, and when the soldiers caught a couple of rebels, they would tie them together by the necks and throw them over your shoulder to choke to death." "How could it be me?" muttered the stockman. "I'm only 22. "Say that again and I'll tear your damned tongue out," roared Foxley, with a threatening movement towards Allen. McCoy interposed again. "Here, Phil, leave the long slab of a ghost alone and come and have some food." Foxley consented to go to the table, putting a pistol beside him before he began to eat. When the meal was ended, his insane obsession reawakened. He shouted for Allen, whom he insisted upon calling Hempenstall, and forced him to sing to him, and then thrashed him with a stock whip for making ugly faces. Tiring quickly of this, he next insisted upon all 3 men dancing jigs, while he flicked wickedly at their legs with a whip to quicken their steps and liven up the dance. He carried on this way until sunset, ignoring the pleas of Smith and McCoy that they should hasten away before the help arrived, which the escaped horsemen would be sure to send or bring. At first he just met their suggestions for flight with an idiotic laugh, but when after nightfall they began to press him urgently to go, he worked himself up into a fury and told them to go by themselves. Rashleigh hoped that Foxley would persist in his course so that they might all be captured, but at last Foxley consented to go, and the weary travelling from crime to crime seemed to be about to start all over again. When, however, they had gone about a mile from the clearing, the mad leader insisted on passing the night in a convenient thicket, and not all the entreaties or warnings of the others could shake him in his decision. They set off early next morning, but had only been on the march a few minutes when they came upon a camp of native blacks, from whose attitude it was clear that they had seen the white men approaching and were prepared to attack them. The firearms of the bushrangers, however, gave them a tremendous advantage over spears and boomerangs, and after a tough fight the aborigines fell back, and the bushrangers pursued their flight. The natives, however, stole along on their flanks and rear, flinging an occasional spear, without, however, wounding any of their foes. In the afternoon the blacks seemed to weary of pursuit, and after 2 hours had passed without any of them showing. The bushrangers halted for the night and hurriedly set about getting a meal ready. Scarcely had they begun to eat when the air was suddenly filled with savage war cries and a shower of spears, and other missiles rained among them. Rashleigh and Smith went down, but were not seriously wounded. Smith and Foxley leapt up and fired their muskets into the thicket in which the blacks were hidden. Yells of pain told that the shots had found billets, and the bushrangers reloaded and fired again. Foxley's madness seemed to have dropped from him at the approach of danger and the excitement of action. With a grin of diabolical satisfaction, he seized a brand from the campfire and, calling upon the others to follow suit, he set fire to the scrubby thicket in which the blacks were concealed. Smith and McCoy snatched up flaming sticks and ran hither and thither, setting fire to different parts of the scrub, until flames were leaping from a dozen points of the dry undergrowth. The wind was blowing into the thicket and carried the fire swiftly among the fleeing aborigines, whose screams and yells were terrible to hear. Soon the trees were alight, flaming like giant torches, while the fire roared, crackled, and hissed, with occasional explosions of pent-up air to add to the alarm and terror of the scene. Some of the bolder natives charged out of the sudden furnace. 2 or 3 were shot as they came out, and the remainder fled, panic-stricken, in the direction of their camp. The fire, having burned out the immediate neighbourhood, could be seen leaping eastward, its glow lighting up the sky for miles. While Rashleigh looked on, appalled at the lengths to which these lawless desperadoes were prepared to go, his imagination shocked by the possibilities of human suffering and loss along the trail of the fire. Foxley burst into a savage laugh of exultation. "They say that a burned child dreads the fire," he said callously, "and if that's so, we can get on with our supper without any fear of them black beggars coming back to disturb us." "I'm not so sure about that," said McCoy. "Maybe they'll come after us for revenge. I've heard say that the blacks in these parts will trail an enemy hundreds of miles for a chance to get even with him." Well, perhaps so," answered Foxley easily. "All we've got to do is keep a sharp lookout, but I don't think they're likely to sneak up on us through the scrub again after the lesson they've had." The party thereupon sat down and finished their meal, and passed the remainder of the night unmolested. They were afoot early the next morning, and at about 10 o'clock they were alarmed to hear the baying of several hounds. All the men except Rashleigh were aware of the significance of this new threat to their safety. They knew the country, and knew that there was not a white man's habitation nearer than 30 miles to where they stood. "By God," explained Smith, "the wind is blowing from the south, and that's where Bathurst lies. Those dogs are coming from that direction, and they've got tracking bloodhounds at Bathurst. I've helped track blacks with them myself. That's what it means. They're after us with bloodhounds." The fact that the baying was growing louder lent emphasis to his conjecture, but all they could do was to stand ready to meet whoever might be coming for them. They were soon put out of their suspense by the appearance of several mounted and well-armed men riding in the wake of the bloodhounds, and several blacks, whose hairless, scorched condition proved them to be members of the tribe who had attacked the desperadoes the previous night. Foxley, showing no trace of fear, watched the pursuers approach with a scowl of bitter hatred and defiance. "They are bloodhounds all right," he said, and looking keenly at the riders, he added, "and by all the devils in hell, there's that blasted MacGuffin at the head of the party, and the young Shanavins alongside of him." A desperate, fierce, fighting expression came into his eyes, and Rashleigh shrank back at the sheer brutal determination of the man. "I don't know what you mean to do," he said to the others, in a voice that was rough with suppressed passion, "but I'll never be taken alive, and I won't be the only man killed either." McCoy and Smith both swore they meant to die fighting, and the 3 desperate ruffians shook hands all round and prepared for the battle. Rashleigh they neglected, and he crept away into a thicket, lying still behind a log, where he could see everything unobserved. The spot they had chosen stood high, a shallow valley running between them and the pursuers, and the ground in front was practically treeless. MacGuffin was first to see the men who had lately tortured him and raped the girl he loved. "Here are the murdering, ravishing dogs at last, hurrah!" he cried in a joyous voice. "Down the swine, my lads!" He fired his piece at Foxley as he spoke, but missed him, the bushrangers having each selected a tree for cover. The 2 young Shanavin boys and the 2 mounted police riding behind them joined MacGuffin in his cheer. They fired a volley, and then, flinging down their carbines, The policemen drew their sabres and galloped up the hill towards the bushrangers, who were now attacked in the rear by a party of blacks armed with spears and boomerangs. The cutting off of their retreat meant nothing to the attacked men, for they had no thought of flight. Foxleigh stood his ground unflinchingly and roared back a cheer of his own in answer to MacGuffin's. "Don't fire until the beggars are close up," he ordered Smith and McCoy. He waited until MacGuffin was on the point of riding him down before he fired, bringing down horse and rider in a heap. MacGuffin, however, was unwounded. He had divined Foxleigh's intention, and checking his horse suddenly, had caused it to rear, so that the animal received the charge full in the head, which was raised like a shield in the front of the rider. MacGuffin was on his knee when Foxleigh rushed upon him with clubbed musket, intending to beat out his brains. The younger Shanavan knocked the weapon out of his hands and brought Foxleigh to the ground with a blow from the butt end of his gun. MacGuffin leaped at Foxleigh as he fell, and a desperate struggle ensued. Young Shanavan danced round, hoping to deliver a coup de grace, but not daring to strike or fire for fear of hitting his friend instead of the bushranger. The two men wrestled for minutes, neither able to maintain advantage over the other, until Foxleigh managed to clutch MacGuffin by the throat and hold him down. His success was his undoing. As he knelt, striving to squeeze the life out of the prone man, one of the policemen brought his heavy sabre down upon his head with a blow that cleft his skull. Foxleigh died without a groan, but such was the tenacity of his grip upon MacGuffin's throat that his right hand had to be severed at the wrist and each finger forcibly prized away. Whilst this struggle was in progress, Smith had shot dead the second policeman, and had been himself mortally sabred by the other, the same man whose timely blow saved MacGuffin's life. McCoy, who had slightly wounded the elder Shanavan boy, was knocked down by the younger one, and after a struggle was overpowered, disarmed, and secured. MacGuffin was some time recovering from the effects of Foxleigh's death grip, and when he rose he addressed the bushranger's corpse. "You wretch," he said with intense emotion, "I've paid my vow at last. I've never been off my horse trailing you since you did it, and I would have hunted you to hell and beyond hell, so I got my revenge." In the grip of passion he kicked the corpse, and, catching sight of McCoy in the hands of his captors, hate of the vileness he had indulged that terrible night flowed through him like a tide. He picked up Foxleigh's gun and rushed towards the bushranger. The man holding him let go, and instantly McCoy snatched a pistol which was hidden in his breast and fired point blank before MacGuffin could close. MacGuffin toppled over, and the policeman cut McCoy down. The fight was ended. The blacks had taken no part in the fight after losing their first flight of missiles, but had been hunting round, looking for the fourth man whom they knew was with the party. They found Rashleigh and led him into the open, just as young Shanavan and the policeman finished attending to MacGuffin's wound. He was instantly recognised and handcuffed, despite his protest that he had been a prisoner in the bushranger's hands. The bodies of Foxleigh and Smith were tied upon one horse, and that of the killed policeman upon another. MacGuffin's and McCoy's wounds were roughly dressed, and each was mounted in front of a rider, the Shanavans, the elder of whom was only slightly wounded, bringing up the rear. Thus the melancholy procession rode into Bathurst, which town was reached on the third day, Rashleigh and McCoy being separately confined. The inquest was held 3 days later, MacGuffin appearing on a stretcher and McCoy tied to an easy chair. A verdict of justifiable homicide was returned in the cases of Foxleigh and Smith, and wilful murder in the case of the murdered policeman against Philip Foxleigh, Christopher Smith, and Andrew McCoy, the last named being held to take his trial at the next sessions of the Supreme Criminal Court at Sydney. Rashleigh, who had not been seen by any of the witnesses during the affray, and who had been found unarmed after it was ended, was next examined before a magistrate, and was committed for trial at the same time and place with McCoy for bushranging and robbery, crimes for which the punishment was death by hanging. Chapter 17. It was some weeks before McCoy was well enough to make the rough journey to Sydney, and Rashleigh remained in prison until the doctors at last passed McCoy as fit to travel. The two men were heavily ironed and placed in a bullock cart, guarded by a posse of mounted police, and Rashleigh was astonished at the kindly attitude of the crowd which assembled to watch their departure. The women in particular seemed deeply touched by McCoy's pallid features and his obvious weakness, and they received many presents of money, tobacco, spirits, and provisions as they made their way through the streets. McCoy's condition made slow travelling imperative if they were to get him to Sydney alive, and the 100-mile journey was accomplished in 10 days. The nights being spent in lock-up houses, the quarters of the road gangs, or at the military stations in the mountains. They passed many parties of their fellow convicts employed on the vast road-building schemes which were then opening up the country, who all expressed sympathy with McCoy in anticipation of his certain fate. The bushranger was unrepentant and indifferent. "Well," he answered on one occasion, "I've had a merry life, if a short one, and I'd sooner go and be hanged 100 times than drudge like slaves as you fellows are doing. Why don't you all turn out like men, and then the blasted tyrants would soon be put an end to?" An overseer asked the corporal in charge of the escort why he did not put a stop to this kind of talk, which so obviously incited the hearers to mutiny and worse. "Why, how can I hinder the poor devil from talking?" answered the corporal with a good-natured laugh. "He's got very little longer to live and talk, anyhow. Let him spout all the what he likes, I say. Besides, friend," he went on with a cunning smile, "don't you know that the more runaways there are, the more rewards there are for capturing them? What would the mounted police do if there were no bushrangers?" Rashleigh, overhearing this remark, recalled the exploitation of crawlers, which he had witnessed on the Emu Plains. They had passed one night at the Penrith lock-up, where Rashleigh was recognised as one who had recently left Emu Plains. A crowd had gathered to see the remains of the infamous Foxley's gang, and among the sightseers were the 3 girls who had been with them at Richmond. They were all much overdressed in the spoils of the marauding expedition against the Shannovans, and pressed to the side of the cart, expressing their sympathy with McCoy and their grief at the death of Foxley and Smith. The prisoners were then removed to the lock-up, and for the first time since their capture, they were confined in the same cell. "What do you think of things now?" said McCoy, when they left alone. "Wouldn't it have been as well if you joined Foxley and the rest of us at the first, seeing as what a dog's life we led you? And here you are, at the end of it all, as sure to be hanged as I am." "As for being hanged," answered Rashleigh, "we've all got to die some way, and I'd as soon be hanged, and out of it, as live the life of cruelty and crime such as that scoundrel Foxley lived." McCoy responded with a nasty sneer. "You dared not call Phil a scoundrel while he lived, and you're an unmanly swine to do so now he's dead." "Look here, McCoy," retorted Rashleigh, enraged, "I tell you that if Foxley had been alone with me, unarmed as I was, or if I'd once been able to lay hold of a loaded musket, he would have known what Ralph Rashleigh dared to do. And as for you, if it weren't that you are sick and weak, I'd beat your brains out on that wall to repay you for some of what you've done to me, you blackguard." McCoy was on his feet in an instant and flung off his jacket. "Come on, you crawling louse. I'll soon show you how weak I am." Recollections of the dastardly treatment he had received from McCoy suddenly maddened Rashleigh, and though he knew nothing of the art of boxing, at which McCoy was expert, he rushed at the bushranger. At first it looked as though he would be knocked out despite his superior strength, but managing to beat down the other's guard, he seized his head by the ears, pushed him backwards to the wall, against which he pounded the bushranger's skull. McCoy howled for mercy, bringing the turnkey into the cell to see what was wrong. Neither man answered his question, and the jailer then inquired which of them was named McCoy. "You, is it?" he said with a smirk to the bushranger. "What would you stand to have one of the lasses that were outside to spend the night with you?" McCoy offered to pay the man £1, which seemed to satisfy him, and he withdrew. As soon as it was quite dark, the cell door opened, and the young woman, who had always favoured McCoy, came in with a basket on her arm, the screwsman following with a quantity of bedding. "There's your sister, young fellow," he said, dropping the bedding, "and here's all the bedding stuff I can muster for the three of you, so you must do the best you can." He went out, carefully securing the fastenings of the door. Rashleigh retired to a corner, while McCoy and his paramour talked in a low tone for some time. Presently a candle was lit, and the young woman took food and 2 bottles of spirits from the basket, inviting Rashleigh to come over and share, which he abruptly declined to do. "Why, I hope you ain't anyways offended with me," she said, "and if you and Sandy have had a few words and a scrap, that's nothing. Surely you can make it up again, especially as you haven't either of you got long to be together, or with anyone else either." McCoy added his invitation to the girls, and at length Rashleigh consented to share the meal, during which the girl remarked that she was reminded of a previous lover's last night on earth, which he had spent with him in Windsor lock-up, he being shot dead next morning in an attempt to escape. She was a type Rashleigh had never encountered, able to take quite calmly, and as a matter of course, the certainty that in a short while the man she had come to see would be hanged. She alluded frankly to his fate, and urged him to die like a trump and split nothing. Rashleigh concluded that her visit was as much inspired by concern for her own and her women friend's safety as by love of McCoy. She was very eager to be assured that there was no likelihood of either man betraying the fact that she and her family had harboured the bushrangers and received the property stolen from the Shanavins, part of which was then on her back. When she had been assured by McCoy that he would keep dumb about these things, she then tried to persuade him to speak up and clear Rashleigh of the charge against him by stating the truth about his position in Foxley's gang. "I'm blowed if I'd do any such thing," said McCoy with an oath. No, Soph, let the crawling beggar die, then he can't tell any tales." The girl at once abandoned her entreaties, satisfied that she had won Rashleigh's friendliness by having made the suggestion, and thus assured herself that he would not betray her and her friends. They sat on until the whole of the 2 bottles of spirits were drunk, and then all 3 lay down to sleep. In the morning the girl took a cheery farewell of McCoy, promising to follow him to Sydney in a day or 2. "Goodbye, young fella," she said, shaking Rashleigh's hand. "I hope you won't bring anybody else into trouble, for that won't do you any good. If you must die, die like a man." Rashleigh assured her that he would never turn informer, and the girl departed. 2 days later the 2 prisoners reached Sydney Jail, and joined the company of the offscourings of the worst sections of the criminal population. The authorities were concerned with nothing but the safe custody of their charges, and there was no discipline in the place except what would ensure this. Immediately Rashleigh and McCoy were admitted into the prisoners' room. They were set upon by a filthy mob of fellow convicts, and stripped naked of every stitch of clothing, except the dirty rags on their legs, which was seen to prevent the chafing of the fetters. Luckily Rashleigh had concealed his small stock of cash in these rags, after the plunderers had gone through all their pockets and taken everything of any value. Some of their clothes were given back to them, and the 2 men were ironically declared free of His Majesty's jail. Newgate had been bad enough, but it was clean and luxurious compared with the conditions in which Rashleigh now found himself. 120 human beings were crowded into a room about 40 feet long and 20 wide. Most of the prisoners were filthy in body and mind, and unspeakable vices were practised without restraint. And as Rashleigh contemplated the possibility that if he were not hanged he would most likely have to spend the remainder of his life in this or a similar place, he sank into utter despair. One morning he was taking exercise in the allotted space in the gloomy prison yard, when he heard his name shouted by a turnkey, and he was led to the hall. Here he found MacGuffin, accompanied by a young woman whose face was familiar. MacGuffin's introduction helped his memory. "This is my wife, young man, Miss Shanavan, that was." "Yes, I am," said Mrs. MacGuffin eagerly, "and I am come to see you, because I haven't forgotten the cruel knock you got from that wretch that's dead for trying to save me and my sister." She burst into tears at the memory of that awful night, and MacGuffin, putting his arm round her, said to Rashleigh, "We have brought a few things for your comfort. I did not see the blow you got of which my wife speaks, but I believe her, because I know that I shouldn't have got away from that blasted gang of scoundrels if you hadn't turned obstinate with Foxley. If I can do you any good on your trial, you can rely upon me doing it with pleasure." After they had gone, Rashleigh began to hope, as MacGuffin's evidence was sure to be of some service to his case. The day of the trial came at last. McCoy was placed in the dock first, and persisted in pleading guilty, roaring to the court, "What's the sense of being humbugged by such a set of blasted old wretches as that judge and jury? They're going to hang me anyhow, and I don't give a damn. The only thing I'm sorry for is that I was so merciful when I was free. If I had killed a score or two more, they could only have topped me in the head." His flow of abuse was stopped with difficulty, and while the judge was passing sentence, McCoy repeatedly interrupted him in the coarsest language, and when the trial was over, he poured out a torrent of filth and obscenity, while 4 husky constables dragged him out of the court. Rashleigh's case followed immediately. He was charged with being present, aiding and abetting in the commission of a robbery with violence, he being at the time a runaway convict. The evidence of one of the men belonging to the hut on the Comorai was now taken, and was supported by that of MacGuffin as to his apprehension. Rashleigh, called upon for his defence, related the manner in which he had at the outset been taken by the bushrangers, and called upon MacGuffin to testify what he had seen in proof of his being only the bushrangers' unwilling and compelled agent. MacGuffin recounted what had taken place at the Shanavan house, and swore to the fact that Rashleigh was not bearing arms at the time of the affray which led to his arrest. The judge summed up and left it to the jury to decide whether it was possible that the prisoner could have been compelled to remain for so long a period with those lawless men, unless he wished to do so, and whether, in any event, he could not have escaped. After very brief consideration, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, upon which Rashleigh was affected much as he had been at his first trial on a capital charge. Numbness came over his senses, so that he did not hear a word of the judge's eloquence in passing sentence, and he had lost all sense of time and place as he meekly followed the turnkey and left the court. He remained in this entranced state for 14 days, never being able to recall a single incident of that period. It was just blotted out of his memory. He came back to a full consciousness of life on the day fixed for his execution. It was a morning of bright sunshine when the chaplain came to the cell door to accompany him to the scaffold. As yet his mind was not functioning, but the sight of the hangman passing shocked him into understanding. He heard and comprehended at last what the chaplain was saying, and when the principal turnkey came and took him gently by the arm to lead him out, he made no resistance. He went out into the sunshine and looked for a few dazed moments at the blue sea and the shining country round Port Jackson. Then the melancholy procession formed and moved forward. McCoy, supported by 2 Presbyterian ministers, went first, Rashleigh following in the company of the Protestant clergyman, with the friendly turnkey helping him. They were attended by the sheriff and the officers of the jail, and a few strangers who had come to witness the execution. With the chaplains earnest in their exhortations, the prisoners entered the gallows yard, around which stood files of prisoners, mostly heavily ironed, who were mustered to witness the hangings. They reached the scaffold's foot, and the turnkey, who had been supporting the nerveless Rashleigh, left his side for a moment. He tottered and swayed, and was on the point of falling when the hangman caught his arm. "Keep up your heart, old cock," he said kindly. "It will soon be over." This rough consolation and the touch of the abhorrent official served to restore Rashleigh to some degree of strength. McCoy was by this time already on the platform, and Rashleigh, nerving himself for a last effort to play the man, ran rather than walked up the flight of steps. A few feet away was the prison wall, outside which was assembled a great crowd of townspeople who had come to the execution as to an entertainment. Their talk and laughter mingled with the words of the chaplains, busy persuading the condemned men of the hope of salvation. Ralph Rashleigh looked down at these people with dim eyes, without resentment, but wondering why they were there. Glancing round, he saw that the rope was already round McCoy's neck, and, according to custom, the executioner was offering to shake his hand. Amazed, he saw McCoy throw the whole weight of his body forward against the hangman with such force that the functionary reeled and fell from the platform to the flagged pavement 16 feet below. "There, you bugger," shouted McCoy. "I hope I broke your blasted neck." A burst of applause broke from the assembled convicts, and then, without warning, the drop fell beneath McCoy. The crash of the falling drop was the last sound that Rashleigh heard for many weeks. He returned to consciousness in a bed in the jail hospital, and learnt that he had been reprieved through the intercession of Mrs. McGuffin, who had gone personally to the governor and petitioned successfully on his behalf. He was told that his sentence had been commuted to 3 years' labour at the penal settlement of Newcastle. That was part 4 of the story of The Adventures of Ralph Rashleigh by James Tucker. I hope you got something out of that. It starts to make sense now, the stories of why people had a sort of soft spot for bushrangers. Not so much for what they did, but I think those that gave them supplies felt a sort of kindred in spirits. There are also convicts who had physically and mental abuse by those in authority who were criminals themselves at some time. Anyway, I guess I'll say goodbye now. Until next time, I wish you well.